Okay, so welcome back to the Comic Book Historians podcast with Alex Grant and Jim Thompson. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. Erik Larsen, co-founder of and former publisher of Image Comics, known for drawing and writing comics since the 1980s, including Megaton, DNAgents, Punisher, Doom Patrol, Spider-Man, and his magnum opus flagship character, Savage Dragon. Erik, thanks for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I know you were born in 1962.
Yeah.
You and I are practically the same age by a year or two off, and a day off. You're December 8th and I'm December 9th. You're born on the same day as my dad. So that's a really good thing.
Awesome.
So talk about, you were born in Minneapolis, but I know you moved to Washington and then California. Talk about whens and how and whys.
I'm not really 100% sure on all the whys. I think it was, people going to school at the time, and it was just like, all right, we're done with the University of Minnesota. Time to move on to something else. My dad was a teacher eventually, and he's kind of a nomad, kind of like to. Mm-hmm. Didn't like to settle down anywhere. It never seemed like we were living anywhere for very long.
So he was a professor?
Yeah.
What field?
He was teaching a lot of English stuff, and he was doing a lot of plays and doing the drama stuff. So he was kind of all over the place.
So he sounds like he was a creative
person. I never
person.
took any of his classes, so I don't, I can only just go, I think it was this.
Mm-hmm. Was he in terms of you becoming a writer, which you are, was he in any way an influence?
Just in that he did it. So I know there was, an awareness that he was writing stuff. Mm-hmm. And he, in his later years, was more doing kind of self-help and kind of creating your own kind of everything. He was really trying to get people sort of in the whole back to the land kind of movement that was going on in the 70s. He was hip deep in that kind of stuff. So he was, self-reliance and barter and all this other kind of stuff. He was way into that.
Oh, okay.
Now, were you an early reader?
We kind of grew up with his comics. He bought comics when he was a little kid. And so we had his comics that had been kicking around, and he gave them to us way too early, and we kind of wrecked a lot of comics that probably, would be worth a lot of money later on.
Yeah.
But,
which comics were those?
I mean, he started in the 40s, so
oh wow.
It would be all that Golden Age stuff that is so treasured by everybody.
Oh boy! So did you have an appreciation then for those early artists? Did that in any way impact?
Sure.
Your formative style. Oh, that's interesting.
I mean, he had a big collection of Captain Marvel adventures, and I was really super into that stuff when I was young. Mm-hmm. And then, as years went on, I started getting into my own comics and buying my own stuff. But early on, it was all about the Marvel stuff, and I mean, he bought comics until he grew up with comics, and comics grew up with him. And when they stopped making comics for people his age, then he stopped buying them. So he was getting comics up through the EC stuff.
Great.
And when EC stopped, and he even got him right up until psychoanalysis and MD and all and that. But when they pulled the plug on their comics, he stopped buying comics.
So you were being exposed to people like Jack Davis and people like that, rather than a lot of the people we talked to, especially of your age, were instead growing up on the earliest stuff might be Ditko and Kirby, or the next phase after that. But you were getting exposed to some of those 50s great artists. That's really interesting.
There was a lot of that. I mean, and there was the later stuff too, but I mean, really, I'm not old enough to be around for the early Marvel comics. Those were really before my time. So when I started really reading and buying comics, it was the mid 70s.
Right.
You know, so I don't have any like, oh, I remember when I was reading Fantastic Four 1. It's like, nah, that never happened.
So you were drawing your dragon before you were reading those comics then, sounds like.
Yeah, I had barely anything at that point when I started drawing comics. I think I had like 1 or 2 comics, and that was all I had. You know, so Dragon was more influenced by Dick Sprang Batman than he was kind of any of that other stuff.
Wow.
It's a little bit of CC back Captain Marvel too, because you had the code word, right? You had like turning, saying a word.
Yeah,
turning.
I had Fonte, and their characters would change, and
wow,
awesome.
And I heard that the car basically was from Speed Racer. Were you watching at that point? Were you aware of that kind of stuff as well, or was that just a coincidence?
My Speed Racer was just from we had family who lived someplace else, and they had Speed Racer on their TV, and I was super into it, but it was such a limited thing that I had just seen it like once or twice, and it made this huge impression on me. But I didn't grow up with Speed Racer as a thing because we just didn't have it where we were at on our TV.
And the Captain Marvel influence, that I assumed when I was researching this that came from the relaunch in the early 70s, but you were actually grown up reading the early stuff. The actual back stuff
from the 70s. My dad brought that home, like, oh look, he's back! Isn't this awesome? But those comics weren't very good.
Right.
Yeah. And even with CC Beck doing some of the artwork, it's like these are pretty shaky and kind of dumb.
Well, that's what people said. Yeah.
You know, yeah, and it's like I can see why this didn't catch fire again, because these comics weren't very good.
Right.
Even when you were that young, before you started buying your own stuff, were you more drawn to the CC Beck, more cartoony style rather than the Captain Marvel Jr. Raboy kind of things? Or
we didn't have any. My dad didn't like the Raboy stuff, so he didn't get any of that. So I didn't have any of that. His collection was kind of weird and it jumped all over the place. So you had very little in the way of DC Comics. The DC Comics he had a decent run on Boy Commandos. So that was my first experience with Jack Kirby.
Wow, that's cool.
And then he had like a couple Batman comics and a couple Superman comics, but it wasn't a lot at all.
Yeah.
He loved Captain Marvel Adventures. He had tons of that. He liked Mary Marvel, so he had a fair amount of those, and Marvel Family. He didn't have any Captain Marvel Jr. at all, so the only time I would see Captain Marvel Jr. was in Marvel Family. And then there's books that I go, I don't understand the appeal of this comic at all. And he would have like these long runs on, God, I can't even remember the name of the character now. It was just like, this is just some dude doing sports. It's not it's not doing anything cool. He's just like, oh, do you think he's going to jump the pole vault? Yep. Like, all right. Somehow he was really like, oh, this is great. Blue Bolt, I think, was the name of that.
Right. The Joe Simon Blue Bolt with Jack Kirby. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is actually really notable. I think you're the only one in your age group, or even a little bit older than you, that even grew up on that. That's really fascinating.
Oh, most people go back and they rediscover. They later on become fans of that Golden Age stuff, and they like Jack Cole or they like something like that. But it's not as a kid, and so that's really interesting that you had that exposure. Which I think impacts.
Jack Cole's another one. He bought a bunch of those. He had a bunch. So he had a bunch of Plastic Man. He had the Barker. You know that book?
I don't know Barker.
No.
Yeah, that was another quality comic. So
really? Oh, I'm going to look that up.
He was in that. That was a fun one because it was set in a circus, and a bunch of the circus characters were out solving crimes and getting into stuff. I don't know who drew it. I would have to look it up to.
That's pretty cool. The Barker, how fascinating.
So there'd be like this guy who had 4 arms, and he was out like he was the circus freak, and then there was the fat lady and stuff like that. The strong man who was a big dope. It was like, this is cool stuff. But I mean, he had eclectic taste. He was kind of all over the board.
Yeah. That's pretty cool.
It's kind of neat.
Did you have those books? I know were those part of what you lost in the.
Yeah. He had given me all his comics at one point, and then they all went away. So it's like,
boy, did you use those as references when you were first starting and doing stuff?
Not really. Not a lot. No, I mean there was certain things that I would look at and go, look at the approach for drawing covers that these guys would do, but I've never really been one of those guys who sits there and draws with a bunch of artwork scattered in front of me. I was just like, I got to get my work done. I can't just be sitting there reading this stuff, or I'll never get anything done. Right.
So when you're reading your own stuff and you're picking out things that you're interested in the mid 70s, now Marvel is still doing some of the horror stuff, but it's kind of faded. That's more the very early 70s. I was reading a lot of that, the Man Thing and Tomb of Dracula and all of those books. Mm-hmm. Were you more reading the superhero things?
I was more reading the superhero things. I did get some of the Mike Plug Man Things. Yeah, so I did get some of that stuff. Man Thing, Giant Size Man Thing, all that stuff. But I wasn't big on the horror books. I didn't get into Tomb of Dracula at all as a kid. I was reading kind of all the mainstream Marvel stuff. So Hulk, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, all that sort of thing.
What about, did you ever look at Warren magazines, any of those things?
Nope. Those were not, they didn't exist where I was.
I gotcha. Yeah, distribution.
So, I mean, a lot of this stuff is just limited to whatever happened to be at the spinner rack in Rexall Drug at Fort Bragg, California.
That's right.
Now, were you drawing, what I used to do is I would just take a issue of the Hulk, like a Herb Trimpe issue, and just copy the splash pages. Were you drawing things like that, or your own comics? You were drawing your own comics.
I was drawing my own comics starting in about 4th grade, and they would just be 8.5 by 11 paper folded in half, and then I would just tell my own stories and even use Marvel and DC characters. I would have just Superman just come by and be part of the story, and whoever else I just felt like, oh, here's Batman. What's going on with Batman? Me and a buddy of mine in 6th grade created these characters called the Deadly Duo, which we later used. And we just used that book was basically just our team up book. And so we had all sorts of unauthorized guest stars who just drop on by and be part of that.
That's awesome.
And they were real characters. I mean, from other comics.
Like, hey, here's the Deadly Duo are teaming up with Batman this issue.
Right. Crossovers already.
Yeah. Or getting into a farting contest, and it's like, it's totally what they would do.
So, at what point did you think, I'm really going to try to do this? I want to be a comic book artist or a comic book writer.
I knew early on that I really enjoyed it, and that I wanted to continue to do it. It must have been super early, but I'm not sure how conscious it was until, later on when Jim Shooter at one point in one of those Marvel fanfares was kind of talking a little about the process and
okay.
Hey, people can make a living doing this sort of thing, and but I at that point I had already been drawing my own comics for quite a while.
Right.
But just the idea that, guys actually do this stuff. I think like the How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way ended up being super influential for a lot of people who kind of didn't even realize, this is a thing that people do.
Yeah, right. Yeah, like the John Buscema Stan Lee book.
Like, we didn't know really how this stuff came about. And so it's like suddenly there's this instructional book on that. It's like, holy crap, this is opening up a whole new world here.
Wow, that's cool. Yeah.
Were you reading when Kirby left DC and came back to Marvel? Were you reading the 2001 and Devil Dynasty? I mean, some of that seems like stuff you would have loved to have drawn yourself.
I was getting Jack stuff when he was still at DC towards the end. So my early Jack would be Commandy and the Demon, and it was all post New Gods, but Mr. Miracle was still coming out. I had some of the Mr. Miracle stuff.
Did you read The Losers?
Did not even see The Losers until some years later.
Yeah, me too. I don't know where they put that, but I never saw that. And I bought everything that Kirby was doing at that point, and I didn't even know about The Losers.
Yeah, there were
years later.
I managed to get all of his first issue specials. So, Atlas, Dingbats of Danger Street, and Manhunter were all like, "Oh, these are awesome! These are the greatest comics ever told."
Right.
So I was totally into his work once I keyed into this is this guy and this is his style. I was definitely on board. And then when he came back to Marvel, it was like, oh, holy crap, here we go.
Oh, that's awesome.
I was down for him doing Captain America and all that stuff. Because at that point, those were books that I wasn't reading them.
Right.
Yeah.
So you jumped on the bandwagon once he started doing them.
So as soon as Jack was there, I was like, oh, I know this guy was great, and he's now doing this book that I know that I've heard of,
Yeah. So like the Bicentennial Mad Bomb and all that stuff.
Oh yeah, all that stuff.
Yeah.
All that stuff and Treasury editions and everything.
Yeah.
So was Kirby your biggest influence at that point, or who else? I know you were reading like Ross Andrews Spider-Man, but I assume that you recognized the difference between those.
Yeah. Jack was huge, and Herb Trimpe was really big for me because he was the Hulk guy.
Yeah, right.
And I loved the Hulk.
So
it was those two were.
Those are the two.
Were key. Gil Kane early on too, and I'm not sure what he was even doing because he never stayed on anything for very long.
Right, he was doing so many covers, right? That's maybe
he was doing a million covers, but and he would occasionally do something, and then I would jump on that, whatever it was, whether it's a giant sized Spider-Man or whatever it was. I would eat those things up, but I was always kind of like I wanted him to do a run on something, and he just wouldn't do it.
Right.
And because his runs were earlier on. He had done Green Lantern,
the DC, for
years and years.
Right.
But once he had been somewhat established, for whatever reason, he never kind of got back to doing longer runs again.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think at that point he was just like, look, I want to just draw a bunch of covers, have fun, make some money, at that point, probably.
He did some good Conan stuff, though. I mean, some of the stuff he did with Roy Thomas on Conan was really seemed to revive his interest in actually caring to some degree.
Yeah.
So at what point you were 8 when you started to create a version of Savage, or at least somebody called Savage?
Dragon
rather.
Savage. He would have just been Dragon at that point.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that character.
Well, he was a combination of Batman and Speed Racer at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And he would drive around in a super cool car, and I had just a bunch of stuff that I was really into, and it was I got this guy who's basically Captain Kirk, and he's a cool character, and then I had so at some point I kind of merged a bunch of my characters together to become one dude, and that was the Dragon at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And none of it makes a damn bit of sense when you. At this point, it's hard to even talk about it because it doesn't make any sense. It's all through the eyes of a child, and the child is like, I don't know how any of this shit works,
Mm-hmm. Right?
It's like, I think people rode around in the desert on the backs of dogs. Isn't that all that? It's like, no.
So by 10 years later, when you were self-publishing graphic fantasy, you're putting. Is it the same character as Dragon, or what's the pathway from when you're drawing it and when you're actually putting it out as part of the fanzine?
Graphic fantasy really followed directly from what I was doing as a kid, so it was kind of putting a cap on those ideas of that I had at that point. So there's very much continuation, but I kept reinventing the characters as a complicating factor in all this. Mm-hmm. As I would keep just going, no, maybe I'm going to have him be this way. No, I'm going to have him be that way. Right. At some point, I had decided it would be cooler to do a Hulk kind of thing. And I had a character named William Johnson would turn into the Dragon in kinds of stress, like the Hulk. And so when William, and then he'd put on a costume. He wasn't a green guy. He was just he would just be a beefier version of William Johnson, and then he would wear this green mask like Batman. And instead of the 2 ears, he had the fin, and so he would be running around doing whatever. And then at some later point, I was like, I'm just tired of drawing this stupid cape and all this nonsense that goes along with it. Mm-hmm. So then I just decided to pull William Johnson and Dragon apart and make them 2 separate characters, and then once I did that, then the obvious choice was just to make Dragon a green guy, because it was pretty much just the same visual, except now it didn't have the mask line on it anymore.
Right. Yeah, it was the actual guy himself. Yeah. So
And
then Ajax Comics Group, we chatted about this a little bit on Facebook. Is although it says Ajax Comics Group, it is a fanzine. Did you and your friends publish it, or what was it?
I had my dad was like I said, he was a teacher, and later on when he was doing workshops, he was printing up these books that would go to these workshops, and so he had bought a tabletop offset press, and I was like, I could print comics on this press. And so those comics were physically printed by me.
Oh.
In my living room.
Oh, that's awesome. I didn't know that. Oh, okay.
So it was me and a couple of buddies got together and we printed the comics and collated them and put everything in a proper order and really it was very, very hands-on what we were doing.
Wow.
Do they exist anywhere? Do people have those?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I saw one on eBay or something. Yeah.
Yeah, they go for a gazillion dollars because it's this rare first appearance of Savage Dragon and nobody has it.
Right.
You know, it's like, sorry, man. If you want to get this thing, it's going to cost you a lot.
Yes.
All right, Alex, it's
okay. And then just something about the graphic fantasy fanzine is that it got good reviews through the Comics Buyer's Guide, and Cat Yronwode was noted to have enjoyed your writing at that point. So you were writing.
I was doing everything. I was lettering. Penciling, inking, lettering. It was sending stuff ready to be printed, and it was terrible.
Yeah.
By anybody's definition, it's like awful comics.
But you cut your teeth on it. You got better at it and everything.
Yeah. You got to start somewhere.
So then, and then it's a little bit of a rewind from the graphic fantasy is Charlton Bullseye Comics. That went from 1981 to 1982. Contributors would work for free to Charlton. They would send their stuff in, but they would build their portfolio for working in other professional comics. And you actually submitted the Dragon to this, is that right?
Yeah, that's what the story that I published in as Graphic Fantasy 1 was the story that I submitted to them when I had heard that they were doing this. And everybody, when they would do a story for Charlton Bullseye, that you'd be able to retain the copyright. And that was, even at that point, I knew that was important.
Right, that's good. That's very smart.
So I drew this for them knowing, because I'd already heard, by the time I was almost done with it, it's like, this comics, I'd heard that it was already been canceled. So when I sent it to them, they're like, yeah, by the way, this has been canceled. And I was like, I kind of knew that. But it was, it took me enough time to get it done that had happened in the interim.
Right.
So, like, oh, well.
So you press forward, and then and then you published it with through the fanzine, and then Gary Carlson, if I'm getting the name right, found you through the graphic fantasy work. Was that because it got good rep in the Comics Buyer's Guide? Is that pretty much how that happened?
Yeah, he had bought it through the mail. Actually, a couple different people bought it through the mail who were actively trying to do their own comics.
Right.
And they contacted me about doing work for them on their whatever they were doing.
Yeah.
And so that was early work.
And so then that's how you got hooked up through Gary Carlson to do Megaton in Megaton 1 1983, right?
Yeah. And I did a character, and that was like an anthology book. So it had various things in it. And so the thing I did with him is we co-created a character named Vanguard.
Right.
And there's that. So
and there it is. And then you also reintroduced the dragon in the second issue, I think, right?
Yeah. He had a cameo in that.
So was there like this stipulation that you still own the rights to Dragon, even though you? So how was that discussion take place? I mean, do you remember saying, "Hey, look, I got to keep the rights"?
There was never any discussion about it. Okay. It was just, he would be aware that I own the character already, and so it was like, okay, we're doing this now.
So it was just, and as independent comics, those things become a little more assumed then, I guess.
Yeah, there was never any question about that at all.
I gotcha. And so then after that, you started working for AC Comics and Eclipse, or rather, you did some work for some comics under those banners. Was in 1985 Sentinels of Justice, right, for AC Comics. And that's a pretty eclectic book there. And I guess, and the background, just for the listeners, is that Charlton wanted to license some of their characters to AC Comics with Bill Black, and then they ended up making some comics, but then Charlton ended up not publishing them, so AC Comics published it under Sentinels of Justice, and this is before DC bought the Charlton characters rights, and you did some work on that series.
But when I was doing it, Sentinels of Justice wasn't those characters.
Right. They were those different guys. Yeah.
Yeah, because and a lot of the characters that Bill Black did were characters that are in the public domain that he kind of took and gave a little twist to. So, there was the Captain 3D that Jack had done on his own. he changed the name and he became something else.
That's cool.
So there was a lot of that had gone on there, where it's just, so he wanted to own names and be able to, like Phantom Lady is in public domain, but DC had the name that they were using, so he was like, "Well, I'm going to use the same character, but and the same design, but I'm going to call her the Blue Bulleteer." And
that's cool.
So there's a fair amount of just we can do this because these are the rules, and he was a big Golden Age comics guy, so it was all about what can we do and how can we do this.
Sure. So then, and did you get hooked up with AC because of being found through the Megaton comic? Is that it just kind of grew from there?
I'm not sure how he got a hold of me. I might very well have just submitted stuff to him.
Okay, I gotcha.
Because I was pretty actively just looking for some kind of gig,
right?
Whatever that might be.
Sure. And did you have fun doing those?
I wasn't very good at it. It was a real struggle at that point. I had my strengths, and my strengths were characters kicking the living shit out of each other.
Yeah.
And whenever I would have to do scenes of people just sitting around talking, I just wasn't very good at it. And so there would be pages in there that just were lifeless.
I see.
And then it's like, and that's a problem. And so I did get to work out a little of that, but not enough of it. It took me several years to kind of get some of that stuff figured out.
Yeah, I noticed in Savage Dragon, you'll have a page of dialogue and it'll have like 12 boxes, and there's always something different in each one to help drive the conversation forward, right? And you weren't doing that in those old ones, you're saying?
No, it was just a struggle. When you're starting out, just having a character sitting in a chair properly, can be one of the most difficult things to draw. You're just sitting there going, how does this even work? I don't understand how bodies conform to chairs. This just doesn't make sense to me. But having characters that are in motion, you don't have to worry about a lot of that stuff as much. And so that was the struggle.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and you got to keep it interesting too. Yeah. So then, and then you worked for. You did some work for DNAgents for Eclipse. That was the Mark Evanier Mignot comic for Eclipse Comics. And so do you feel like by this point, first, how did you get hooked up with that work at Eclipse? And then do you feel like you're getting better at this point at pushing a story along?
The connection was I had met Jim Shooter at a convention several years earlier, and we had been corresponding through the mail because every time I would do something, I would show it to him because my goal was I want to be working at Marvel Comics. That is what I wanted more than anything. That
was the goal.
That was the dream. And so I kept showing Jim stuff whenever I would do stuff. And at some point, I I bumped into him at a show in Chicago, and I finally got to meet him after corresponding for a couple years and keep showing my stuff. And he would send back notes saying "close but no cigar" and that sort of thing. And I'm getting closer. And so he looked through my samples. At that point, I was working on Megaton stuff and was working on maybe AC. I'm not even sure. I think some AC stuff. And then he was like, "So you're a professional now?" And I'm like, yes, I am. And then he said, would you like to do something for Marvel Fanfare? And I was like, absolutely. What I didn't know was Marvel Fanfare is code for would you like to do an inventory job that will likely sit in the drawer for years before it's ever published.
Oh, okay.
And they would do those kinds of jobs all the time because they just needed material. There was this back in that day. You had to get the book to the printer on time. If you didn't, the printer would fine you. Yeah. And so there was no such thing as late books. They would slot in a story from anywhere else. They would put a reprint in rather than have there be
a late fee.
Have to pay those late fees. And so, back in the 70s, you would get those occasional reprint comics, and it was always like, what the hell? What happened? I thought George Perez was fast, Yeah. And so when Shooter came aboard, rather than to have there be those reprints, what he started doing is getting inventory stories done, so that if something was running late, rather than run a crappy reprint of something, they're going to run a crappy fill-in story.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which was superior from a fan's point of view, because at least it's something new.
Yes, right.
When I met Shooter, it was hey, you want to do a story for me? And it was for Fanfare, and it was like, absolutely. And I said, let's plot it at the show. And so he was a little taken back, and he was like, all right, let's do it. And so we sat down at the hotel bar there and banged out a plot for an issue of Thor, it would eventually be.
Right.
And so after I had done that with him, then I had the ultimate samples that I could show anybody, because it was like, oh, there's the Hulk and he's fighting Thor.
Right.
And I know those guys, and you're awesome.
Yes.
And it played to my strengths, because they were just kicking the shit out of each other.
Right. No sitting on chairs on that one.
Yeah, there was no sitting in chairs for anybody in the story.
Right.
It just was everything that a comic book needed to be by me. And so when I met Mark Evanier at a convention on Vancouver Island, he saw those samples and was like, oh, I've got to put this guy to work on DNAgents. This is wow. And so I met a couple different people there who were like, okay, you seem like you're about ready. And some of those things pan out, and some of them just don't. Like at the same time, I think I met Bill Willingham and talked briefly about possibly doing some elemental stuff, and that never came about. That just dried up immediately. There was, which was fine, because I ended up doing all sorts of other stuff. But at the time,
that would have been fun to see, though. I would have liked to see your version of that.
Yeah, I mean, whatever. There's characters there. I would have had some fun doing it.
Right.
That was fun, but
and then so you worked on the DNAgents, and then there was also a giant size mini comics #4 in 1986 for Eclipse where the dragon was in a one-page gag story where you're interacting with him, right?
Yeah, and that came about through Paul Curtis.
Okay.
Paul Curtis was a guy who had done a bunch of guys just do these fanzines and do this stuff on their own, and he was publishing these mini comics, and he published a ton of them. And a lot of guys just kind of cut their teeth doing these weird little one-off mini comics. And so it's like, all right, that sounds like fun. And so I did something for them. Yeah, so it's all fun.
Yeah, it's fun. And is it fun interacting with the dragon like in print like that?
I don't even really remember that much doing the story, in all honesty. Yeah, I had done a story for Paul that he never ended up printing because I think he just ended up going off and doing something else or losing interest or whatever. And eventually I did print that story in the back of an issue of Dragon.
Okay.
Years and years and years later. So if you're looking through one of the issues of Savage Dragon at one point, come upon a story where Dragon looks really funky and as a backup story. I think the name of the title of the story was Angel Fueled Quake.
Okay, there you go.
And it was just Dragon and Angel, because Dragon was the single dad raising a daughter in some of these early stories.
Right. So now in 1986, also you did some work with Renegade Press, and you penciled and worked with scripts from, I saw Robin Snyder and Jim Sindstrom. This was like in Murder Issue 1 and Murder Issue 2, and this was kind of like a Snyder and Ditko comic. How'd you kind of get hooked up with them, and how was working with them on that?
I met Robin Snyder lived in the same town that I lived in and went to the comic store that I went to. So he became aware of my work because he was up in Bellingham, Washington.
I see.
And that's where we had settled at some point. So it was purely I know this guy and he can do this basic stuff.
Yeah. And he's close to me, so. Yeah.
And I was really just a warm body. It wasn't anything more than, I don't think he was looking at me as, there's this tremendous untapped talent. I think it was just, I need somebody to do stuff. You're somebody, it's either, and I did some stuff for him that I really shouldn't even have been doing. Cause it was like, I need somebody to letter this. It's either going to be you lettering it or me lettering it, and you're a better letterer than I am. And it's like, well, I'm terrible. I shouldn't be lettering anything. But I ended up doing some little things that he needed, just because he needed somebody, and I was there.
That's cool. And I think a lot of times it's like that, where like you're there, you're available, you can do it. They need something to be done, and that's just kind of how it works a lot of times. All right. Well, now we're going to kind of go to the meat of the things. Jim's going to talk to you about DC and Marvel, and then I'm going to talk to you about some Image comics. So go ahead, Jim.
Okay. So you've already met Jim Shooter, and you've done that, which doesn't see publication for a long time. But your first published Marvel is a fill-in issue of Spider-Man 287 in 1987, right?
Yep.
And you're 25 years old. And it's a Jim Owsley script with the black costume, right?
Yeah.
And the villain is Kingpin.
Yeah, kind of. It's Daredevil in a fat suit.
That's right. It was. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
that's right.
It is an awful, awful comic in every respect. I
was going to say, it's funny because you talked about that Thor issue with the Hulk and all the action. There's nothing happens in this story. I mean,
Yeah, no,
you barely see Spider-Man.
It's so bad. He does eventually get into a fight with Daredevil, but there's so much pieces of stuff going on all the time in that it's just really I couldn't expand it. I had no room to move.
So what were you disheartened after you turned it in, or did you think, well, what could I do? It wasn't my fault, or what were you thinking?
I don't know why I didn't follow up with the editor on that book. To this day, it doesn't make any sense as to why I wouldn't have said, hey, this was work. Let me get more work. I think what it was is that around the time that I was working, when I met Mark Evanier back on and was doing DNAgents, I had also met Mike Gold, who was working at DC at the time.
Okay.
So Mike Gold was actively trying to get me stuff at DC. So he was my guy. He saw something that other people weren't seeing in my work, and he wanted me to do the Teen Titans. That was kind of where he was at. And so
that was super clear, because you start off with that Secret Origins of Nighthawk, which looks like it's an attempt to get your name associated with the Titans more than anything else.
And I did Teen Titans Spotlight. I did two different ones, one on the Omega Man and one on Aqualad. And I even did an issue of Teen Titans, issue 33. But he was, I think what it was is me just letting somebody else take the, it's like, this guy's looking for work for me. Meanwhile, I'm asking for stuff over at Marvel. Rather than having to chase jobs down, I'm just going to take the path of least resistance and stick with this guy who's trying to get me something. He eventually got me Doom Patrol.
In terms of the Teen Titans stuff, that first Nighthawk Secret Origins doesn't look like you very much. It looks like sort of a George Perez filtered through Pat Broderick or something. Were you trying to really look like the next step in the Teen Titans book at that point?
I think it was more of a case that the anchor was so heavy-handed that he just went his own way with it.
I wondered about that.
I was kind of doing the same. I was just doing whatever I was capable of at that point. I mean, that's always the case. It's like, all right, what can I actually do here?
Because when you get to the Spotlight 10 and you're doing Aqualad, that looks like you more than anything I'd seen up to that point. I mean, that was full out Larson looking, and it was fun. Did you enjoy doing that issue?
It was all right. I think he's such a terribly designed character, and I really struggle with that because he was just have that kind of terrible afro that he had. It was just like, oh man, I remember where you were the father of the Brady Bunch, and then you came back that next year and you suddenly had an afro. You were looking cool, Mr. Brady. And it's like, that's not a look you want for a superhero. And I couldn't make it work. Yeah. So I was, but I don't remember who inked. Oh, was that Romeo Tangali then? I don't know.
I don't think it was for that issue. Might have been for the actual Titans one. I don't know.
What I know he inked me on something. God, I don't remember. I don't remember all those guys. It's been too long.
That's a while ago. Like 30 years.
That was a long time ago. And that's not one of those comics that I pull out every now and then to go, oh yes, back to
This is where it is. Yes.
And you did some Outsiders too, but so you didn't get the you didn't step into the Teen Titans title.
No,
but
I didn't. He wanted me to. That he got me a bunch of stuff. I did like an issue of Superman too.
Yeah,
Adventures of Superman. It was just, he was trying to find me something, and I was really grateful that he was out there looking out for me.
Yeah,
I
cool.
sure needed it at that point.
and your very first drawing for DC Comics with that Secret Origins was a Batman. You got to draw Batman from day one.
Yeah, never drawn an actual Batman story.
I was going to ask you about that, but you got that, which turned out to be more Titans than it was anything else. It was almost a false advertising.
Yeah. Well, I did what I could with whatever I got.
That's right. And then with the Doom Patrol in '88, you worked with Paul Kupperberg on that.
Uh-huh.
So how were those scripts? He would like give you a full script, and then you would draw out the full script. That's kind of how they did it at DC, right?
No, they were plots. They were plots.
Oh, it was.
Yeah,
Okay.
there was pretty much everything I worked on, with the exception of the Outsiders, was plot style.
Okay, I see. Oh, cool.
And you weren't the first artist on that. Steve Lytle had done the first 4 or so issues, and then you stepped in. Did he leave the book because he didn't want to do it?
I believe he had some deadline issues. Yeah,
and then you worked on it longer than anybody. You worked on it almost to the very end, and then Nolan came in at the very end. Did you know it was going to be canceled at that point?
No, it wasn't canceled. It
wasn't.
It went on long beyond me.
Did it go long beyond you?
Oh,
I thought it was only a few issues.
No. It went on for years.
Are you talking about you're talking about Grant Morrison, right? Yeah, the Vertigo.
No. But there was a time. I think of that almost as a different thing entirely. But
no,
yes,
it was right on the heels. I had decided I was offered some stuff at Marvel, and at that point I was kind of not super happy doing the Doom Patrol for whatever reason. I'm not even sure why. I guess I didn't. I mean, the writing stuff wasn't awesome. It was just kind of okay. And at every issue it would be like, well, how do I make this make sense? Because it just wasn't quite there. Mm-hmm. And the editor was really just kind of giving me carte blanche to do whatever the hell I wanted on it. And in some cases, I was really taking some huge liberties with the plots because I was just like, this doesn't work. I know better than this guy. Yeah. And it's like, really at that time and at that age, it's kind of crazy that they were just letting me do whatever the hell, because it's like I didn't have any real experience doing this stuff. I've barely been in the business for a couple of minutes, and already I'm just sitting there tossing out huge hunks of his plot because I just didn't think it worked very well. Yeah, I was like, there's no reason that they should have let me do that.
Were you learning to be a better cover artist at this point? Because I think of that General Immortus cover. I think it was the last. You didn't even do the art for that inside, but that was your last cover for Doom Patrol, and it's a great cover. I mean, and it seems like you're really coming to an understanding of what makes a good cover at that point.
Yeah, I was working on that. There was the cover editor at that point. Actually had me start laying out covers for other artists because he liked what I was doing. So yeah, there's a couple other books out there that I could go, I laid out that cover of that one. So that was kind of a neat period to be able to do some of that.
Were you a Walt Simonson fan also?
Yeah. also, yeah.
Because there's almost like it feels like like in those there's almost a Simonson feel to it, but it's your stuff.
Yeah, I was very much into his stuff.
Did you go back and look at the early Doom Patrol, the original?
I didn't have any access to that at all.
Oh, okay, all right, because that's fun. I mean, that's
yeah. I know. I got it years later after the fact, and was kind of like, oh yeah, this is actually kind of cool. Oh well, this would have been nice to have had at the time, but I didn't. So.
And during this period, before you went back to Marvel, you did do a Hulk over top of McFarlane's layouts, right?
Yeah, Todd had done thumbnails, so they were on separate sheets of paper, and that was kind of fun.
And like that Spider-Man, it doesn't really have the Hulk in it. It was funny. It was, looking at that, it's got a great Hulk, but barely in the issue.
Yeah, it was funny for anybody but me. Yeah, no, at the time I was like, I wanted to do the book and didn't really get to do the character even in the book. And
that's what I noticed. It was kind of funny to see two in a row like that. And then you go to Marvel in 1989, and they give you the ideal book for you, right? Punisher.
Yeah.
And he's joking, by the way, because I think because he mentioned he knows that you had your heart set on doing Nova, right?
Well, I mean, at that point, I just would take whatever I could get my hands on.
Right.
And they had offered me that, and it was like, all right, that's a book.
Mm-hmm.
And Mike Barron would draw the scripts, so I would get these like really poorly drawn, but decently enough told. See, the stories were broken down into panels. You knew how many panels were going to be there. You knew what the action was going to be. Right. All the dialogue was there. And so you could just kind of follow along and do the best you can with it. And so that was, at least he had done that part of it, breaking that part down for me.
That's cool.
So that was kind of neat. Yeah.
But I love those issues though, because that was like, those were prime years for me as a teenager reading comics and stuff. So I like your Punisher a lot.
Well, good. So I know some people do. Some people are like, yeah, that was awesome stuff. I don't know what your problem was.
I had one more DC story I wanted to go back to. You did a Legion of Superheroes issue, which I'm a big Legion fan. But you seem like the
part of one. I already part of one. It was a fill-in issue. They needed to get that book caught up, and they had 3 different short stories with 3 different artists.
You did the block section though, right?
Yeah, I did that because again, it was one of those situations where timing was everything. I was sharing a studio with Al Gordon, who is the inker of the book, and so he could recommend me when it came to that.
He inked more than one thing for you, didn't he? I noticed his name coming up.
Quite a few different things here and there over the years. Yeah, and I thought we worked pretty well together. So
I see.
And Block seemed like a character that was kind of made for you. I mean, it did go to your strong points.
Yeah.
He's knocking down walls all the time and such.
Yeah. That was it's like I don't really remember it that much. My only real lasting thing on that was I remember designing a villain for that story that Keith Giffen killed the next issue because he couldn't figure out how to turn him.
Right.
Because I had drawn him from like one angle, and it was like I can't figure. I'm sorry that I killed your guy, but I couldn't figure it out. It's like, all right, whatever.
So when you were doing the Punisher, were you trying to get off of the Punisher while you were doing it, or trying to get some other book instead?
I was always pitching stuff, and I had pitched Terry Cavanaugh, somehow I get hooked up with him on Marvel Comics Presents.
Mm-hmm.
He's the editor of that. And at some point I had pitched to him writing and drawing a Nova serial for Marvel Comics Presents.
Mm-hmm.
And it was approved. And so when it got approved, I was like, well, I want to be writing and drawing my own stuff. So let me jump on that. And so I left the book, and the editor was not super pleased with me leaving the book so abruptly, but this is my big chance to write and draw my own stuff, and I wanted to do that, so off I went. And then once I had left the book and was supposed to do it, then they're like, oh no, we're actually going to do something different with Nova in New Warriors. Your story doesn't really work with that, so I'm sorry, but we can't do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you found yourself without an ongoing book.
Yeah, suddenly I didn't have a gig, and so Terry came up with that Excalibur serial.
There you go.
In Marvel Comics Presents, and so that's why it's like I don't read Excalibur. I'm not a huge fan of Excalibur, but I need work.
Right.
So
I'll do it.
That's why I ended up doing Excalibur, and then the Excalibur stuff actually is what ended up getting me more Spider-Man. I think because the editor of Spider-Man had seen what I was doing on that. And it's like, oh, let me try you out on doing some more Spider-Man.
Right. Who was the editor at that point?
That was Jim Salicrup.
Yeah, Salicrup. That's right. Yep. And then before Jim talks to you about the Spider-Man, when that Thor issue finally got published with him fighting the Hulk, that came out in '87, and Vince Colletta inked it, right?
Yeah. Well, he had inked it way earlier. So I had seen that thing and had it, in my possession as not a physical, I had Xerox.
Not a comic yet.
So that took the wind out of my sails.
Right.
I was just like, oh my god, this is the worst thing ever. This is terrible.
Yeah. I was gonna say, because it didn't have that same feel of your other stuff. I had a feeling that the inking is responsible for that. So you were disappointed then about that inking job because it was a Thor versus Hulk fight.
Years later, I look back at it and think it's pretty neat, just because because it's like I'm getting inked by Vinny, and the story was scripted by Stan.
Yeah.
So in this kind of cool way, I'm subbing for Jack.
That's right.
Classic lineup, and that would be the last issue of Thor that Vinny would ever ink, and the last issue of Thor that Stan would ever script.
Right.
So it was like, well, in that respect, it's kind of cool.
Yes, and with the action and foreshortening the blowouts in your comics, it's like it makes sense that you'd kind of carry that torch from Jack in a sense.
Yeah, well, it was that part of it was kind of awesome.
Yeah, so. that is awesome. And I got that vibe too from it. I was like, oh, I think this is like the end of those guys, but the beginning of Erik in a way.
So at the time that you're working on Excalibur and all of this, Todd McFarlane is sort of becoming on fire on Amazing Spider-Man, right? People are starting to really notice his webs and his work. Did you know him at this point? Were you all in the offices together?
No, we never. None of us shared an office together at any point. Todd was living in Canada and then later moved to Portland. And now he's in Arizona. But I had met Todd. Todd was working on what was the book he did at DC? Ongoing book.
Oh yeah.
Infinity
Yeah.
Incorporated.
Yeah, Infinity.
Yes,
That's right.
So I met Todd when he was working on Infinity Incorporated. I think he had just done a quickie fill-in on Spitfire and the Troubleshooters, which was his. I think that was his first Marvel gig. They needed somebody who could turn out. They needed a fill-in, and Todd said he could do it in 3 days, and so he did. Batted this thing out, and then that kind of opened up some doors for him, and so he went from doing his regular gig over at DC to doing whatever he could get his hands on at Marvel. And so I knew him when I had done the fill-in on Spider-Man. I had actually was friends with him at that point, and had gone over to his house or apartment, and there's a character Solo that was introduced in that story.
Right.
Well, I was the guy who first visualized Solo.
Oh, cool.
Because he hadn't been, and he appeared in 324, but Todd was still working on 323. And so when I went and visited Todd, I was sitting there penciling in his costume.
Oh, that's cool.
Oh, that's right. I really heard that.
Because it's like, so I can help him out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I liked Solo when he came out. I remember seeing that on the stands. Yeah.
So there were a few little things in 323 where I could point to different panels and say, oh yeah, I went in and repenciled some of this, and then Todd inked it and stuff like that. There's often in comics there ends up being a lot of those little things that go on between creators that you aren't even aware of. You look at years later and go, yeah, that panel always looked funny to me. And it's like, oh yeah, that's because that, like, part of the Phoenix story where in the X-Men there was one of those where Al Gordon inked some faces in there, and when you're aware of it and you're looking at it, it's like, oh yeah, these faces don't look like the rest of it. This looks a little out of place. That's interesting.
Right. That is cool. And then you find out later why.
You find out later why, or you don't.
Right.
In that Excalibur serial, there's a panel or a figure that Bob Smith inked, and it was like, I pulled it out. I could see it immediately when Terry said, hey, Bob inked something in here. It's like, is it this? But most regular people just reading comics, I don't think they're that aware of situations like that when somebody will come in and do a little something.
So you took over Amazing Spider-Man with 329. It's still, you're not writing it. David Michelin is writing it. Michelini is writing it at this point. And were you under pressure to make it look as much like Todd McFarlane as you could, or was it just go in there and be yourself?
It was go in there and be yourself. But when I had followed Steve Lytle on the Doom Patrol and did whatever the hell I wanted to, the reaction from fans was horrific, because it was like, oh my God, what's going on here? This is terrible. And it was such a strong negative reaction that I thought, coming on Spider-Man, well, Todd McFarlane is 20 times the fan favorite that Steve Lytle was or would ever be. I'd better do my best to try and ease in the transition here. So, and I had also at some point, John Romita Jr. had followed Paul Smith on an X-Men thing. And he just was like, well, I'm drawing the second half of a story that Paul had started. I'm going to try and ease into it. And so that was kind of where I was thinking of on this was I'm just gonna play this as safe as humanly possible and not come in there and go, hey, here's my thing, kids.
Right.
Go fuck yourselves. It's like
well, at the time, it felt like a pretty smooth transition for me as I was collecting it in real time. And I think what Jim, even John Romita Sr. did the same with Ditko. Like there was a transition going from Ditko to Romita Sr. So
yeah, that's a good point. He did try to look a little bit. I mean, I think he failed, but he tried to look like Ditko.
Right in the beginning.
I think that's the case here too, where I look at it and go, I didn't pull it off at all as far as I'm concerned. When I look at it, I don't think it's a successful transition in terms of looking like Todd. Yeah. But somebody thought it worked all right.
I mean, so, yeah, and I actually I favor your Mary Jane over Todd's because that was the first. You hit me at just the right age where that was the first.
That's the beauty of that. Hitting people just right.
You hit me just right with that one, but at that time, but that was the first comic book crush I kind of had as I was reading comics. So yeah, that was the Mary Jane. I remember the panel too. So.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Now, Spider-Man, you had read Spider-Man as a kid. But you were more Kirby influenced certainly than Ditko influenced. Was this a title that you really wanted to work on a lot, or was it just it was Spider-Man, so you're certainly going to take it?
I understood that it was a good gig, but I was always more of a Kirby guy and not a huge. I mean, I liked Ditko's work, but I didn't consider him a major influence, and so this was a struggle for me to do the book, and I just got out all the Ditko stuff I could, and had it out there, and was just looking at it, trying to pick things, and okay, what can I do to make this look like Steve? And there was a fair amount of that. And especially once Randy Emberlin came on board as inker, I think we're kind of able to do more Ditko-y looking stuff than I did earlier than that.
So let's talk about the villains a little bit, because that's, I think, what Ditko gave us as much as anything. Were one of the best rogues galleries in comics, and you go in there and you're getting to play instantly with all of the big ones. Who was easy for you to do? Who do you think you contributed, like actually really up them a little bit, or what was your experience with different villains of those early Spider-Mans you were doing?
Well, my favorite was, I like Dr. Octopus in terms of just visually what I was able to bring to him. Because at that point he had just been this kind of pudgy guy in tights. And it's like, you don't put a fat guy in tights. It's just cruel and unusual punishment for everybody involved.
It wasn't Ditko's fault, because he had him in that lab coat, which he liked to do because he did that with the lizard too. But you put Doc Ock in a suit, didn't you?
Yeah. And that was none of that was asked for at all. But what I really wanted to do when I was working on the book was to kind of restore some of those villains to their former luster. Yeah, and that was more my goal than anything. And you can see in there at some point there was a transition on my part where I made that as a change. If you look at 327, there's a panel that has a Kingpin in it, and he's just like a ball. I just draw him as this big ball. and it was kind of following, in my mind at least, what Sienkiewicz had done with him. And it was like, all right, I'm gonna have fun with this guy. And then later on, when I'm drawing Kingpin, he's much more formidable looking. And that just came about with me really internalizing the whole thought process and going, well, what benefits Marvel more? Having this guy be a big cartoon character or having him be a formidable villain?
Right.
And once I got into that mindset of let's make these villains as awesome as they can be rather than make fun of them.
Right.
then I was able to do some kind of cool stuff with some of those villains and trying to pump things up in visually and make them neater looking and make them more powerful looking or whatever.
Right. Yeah, and I love the Dr. Octopus that you did. I think it's my favorite because his tentacles are all over the place.
Yeah, the tentacles are great.
It was fun to play with that.
I mean, amazing. I mean, because it really shows like Spider-Man's acrobatics are like tested to their utmost limit when you were doing that Dr. Octopus.
Yeah, and it was fun to be able to play with that. I also like that most often he's not really paying much attention to Spider-Man at all. He's like pouring himself a cup of coffee.
Yeah, that's right.
Just doing any other thing because it's like you're so beneath me and I don't really need to do anything.
That's right. I remember that.
And watching Doc Ock punching back and forth with Spider-Man was always a stupid concept because he's an old scientist guy and he's got these great weapons. Why is he using his fist ever?
Yeah, no, there's no point in that. At that point I was sharing the studio with a couple of different people. One of them is an artist named Pete McDonald, and Pete was doing commercial art, and he had done. Do you remember what color forms? You know what those are?
Yeah.
He did the Dick Tracy color forms because the Warren Beatty movie was out around that time, and so he got all these character drawings of all the various Dick Tracy villains. And that was kind of what influenced giving Dr. Octopus a suit, because seeing all those gangsters in their suits, it was like, oh, I'm gonna give Spider-Man a suit.
Yeah,
so that's where that came about.
Mm-hmm.
And while you were doing this, were you feeling more and more like you wanted to write your own stories, even on Spider-Man?
I wasn't necessarily thinking I should do more Spider-Man stuff. A lot of the jobs that I got were just jobs that were available.
Right.
They weren't necessarily, things that I sought out to do. Mm-hmm. And that's just the way of the world. You very seldom do you actually, or at least for me, very seldom did I actually end up with assignments that I really wanted. It would just be, all right, this is available. You want to do it?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. It did seem like that. Now, what did you think when they told you you're going to do a Captain Universe Spider-Man? Did you know what that was?
I knew what it was because I read everything.
Mm-hmm.
So were you actively enjoying comics at that point and reading everybody else's work?
Yeah.
Oh, that is awesome. I don't hear that too often, actually.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, no, I was buying and I was reading everything.
So were you buying DC stuff too?
Sure. I was buying everything.
I mean, that's interesting because Marvel had the artists that were really game changers, but DC was where I was in law school at that point, and I was reading all the Vertigo stuff and all the Moore and then Morrison and all of that, and that was also game changing.
Yeah. Well, I was reading Alan Moore's stuff when he was working on Warrior magazine.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
So I knew, all the Marvel Man and V for Vendetta and all that other stuff. Yeah. So when he came over and was working on Swamp Thing, that store was ready for him. We knew this guy is a badass. And so they stocked up on that book. And at a time when all other stores were selling, X-Men was their biggest seller. That store's number one seller was Swamp Thing.
Oh, that's awesome.
And that was just because that particular retailer knew this creator and was just, you have got to read this to anybody who would walk in there.
Mm-hmm.
And, enthusiasm is contagious, as they say. So
it is. Yep.
Did you get to meet, being in the industry at this point, did you get to meet some of the people that you thought were, some of the best? Did you get to ever meet, Ditko? Did you meet Alan Moore? I know you did a script but that was after he'd already written it. What's your experiences with some of those people?
I talked on the phone with Alan at one point about 1963, and that was a long time later.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the only time I talked to Alan.
Uh-huh.
I met Ditko up at the Marvel offices, Terry Kavanaugh's office. So I did get to meet him. I met Jack several times in San Diego at different functions. Met Herb Trimpe, met Gil Kane.
Oh, cool. Yeah, because you basically came in right as these guys were all kind of phasing out in a sense.
Yeah,
still doing stuff, but how was Ditko meeting him?
He's just very quiet. He wasn't a chatterbox, and I'd known Robin Snyder, so that was my only connection there. So able to say, hey, I'm good friends with Robin Snyder. And he was kind of like, oh, okay. And then left it at that, So it's sort of like, I didn't have any follow-up.
Yeah. He didn't give much to follow up on in the conversation, it sounds like. Okay. No. That's funny.
Is there anybody that you didn't get to meet that you would have liked to have met?
I can't think of who there would be that I would have liked to have met, mostly because, I would hear tales of, hey, this guy's pretty cranky, so it's like, all right, I don't want to meet this cranky guy. I'd rather have my lasting impression of them be that they're awesome because the comics are awesome.
Like Alex Toth or something like that.
Yeah, like Alex Toth, I'd heard was somewhat cantankerous, and I'd heard that John Buscema was at one of those conventions and was like, oh, I could have met John. He wasn't a huge influence on my work, and I wasn't one of those. I wasn't a super big John Buscema guy. I understood that he was a talented individual, but I wasn't like, oh, I must meet John. So I didn't.
And then was Kirby? Was he nice? Did you enjoy talking to him?
Yeah, for what it was. I mean, it was talking to a guy in a situation where nobody could hear anybody very well.
Oh, I see.
So, that's really what those situations were. There was nothing that I could hang my hat on and say, oh, I got this valuable insight into Jack Kirby. Stuff like that.
We've talked to a lot of people where they had one of those guys be sort of a genuine mentor, like Howard Chaykin. It was Gil Kane. Continuity with Neil Adams and Giordano influenced a lot of people we've talked to. Was there anybody that you actually worked under that taught you things?
No.
Yeah, you're basically self-taught from childhood.
Yeah, no. We were all scattered about. So by the time I moved down to San Francisco when I was 24, and that's when kind of my career was getting going. But there was
also a lot of the guys are like these New York dudes, and you're like a West Coast guy.
Yeah, there was a lot of that, and most of the guys that I knew that were in the industry weren't New York guys. They were just kind of here and there, and everything that FedEx was going great guns by that point. So we would just be mailing everything back and forth.
Right.
We didn't have to live in New York. We didn't have to do all this other stuff.
So where were you living when you did Spider-Man?
San Francisco.
I see. Yeah. So of course you wouldn't be hanging out with them like that. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
That's obviously important. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is very different from the ones that we've talked to, so many of which grew up in Brooklyn. They were all New Yorkers. They said this is why we were doing comics, because we lived where comics were. And you're a different era than that in a lot of ways.
But I relate to it more because I'm from Northern California also. So it's kind of cool to hear your version of that because I'm local to here.
All right. Well, I'm still in San Francisco, so.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I'm in Sacramento. That's right.
I'm in Los Angeles. We're an all California podcast.
This is an all California podcast today. Yes.
Sweet.
So, so then, okay. So now, Jim, did you want to ask anything about Spidey?
I was just going to finish the transition from Amazing Spider-Man to Spider-Man in 1992, and the few issues you did of that before leaving. Was there a difference in your work between the two books?
Just that I wanted to learn how to ink, and I hadn't really inked anything before. And at one point, I called up Terry Cavanaugh at who edited a bunch of stuff, and I know that he is just going through a lot of short stories on in Marvel Comics Presents. So I was just like, I want to learn how to ink. What can you send me that I could just learn to practice on?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And he sent me a Namor annual.
Right. The 1991 annual.
Yeah. So I was just teaching myself how to ink, and he also sent me a Steve Ditko Human Torch story.
Oh wow! Mm-hmm.
So
I remember that.
So
was that fun to ink, and how?
Yeah, it was a gas. The thing with that is I inked that with markers, and it was like, oh, that's a regret. I should have inked it with the real stuff. And so on the Namor thing, I was like, send me whatever inking tools you have to, and I'll see what I'm comfortable with. Right. And so. Yeah, and so I did that job super quick too. They needed it really fast. At one point, they had called me up and said, "Oh, we're worried about this thing. How many pages can you do?" And I was like, "Send me all of them. I'll do it." Mm-hmm. So that was fun.
All right. So as 1992 is, we're in that point of time, and then you're kind of finishing Spider-Man as both writer and artist. Yeah, and so now you're kind of exercising both skills.
That came about because they just needed a warm body again, and I was actually had a proposal in to do Nova,
right?
And so I was kind of waiting on that. Like, are they going to let me do Nova? Because I really want to do Nova, and that was. My unfulfilled ambition was to do Nova. And so I was waiting on that. And eventually, they gave me the Spider-Man thing as something to do, which was fine. And my house burned down in the midst of doing this Spider-Man thing. So that was less fine.
That was the Oakland fire, right?
Yeah, that was East Bay firestorm, and a huge ton of houses went up in that fire, and people lost their lives and all that stuff. We weren't even there, so I couldn't grab anything out of the house or do anything. It was just, sorry, saw our house burn down on the news kind of thing. Like, we didn't even know what was going on, and kind of pulled in there the next couple days later, and was like, oh yeah, it's gone. Oh wow. And so then eventually they approved Nova, but as a mini series.
Yeah.
So this was this a different proposal from the first one you did?
I kept wanting to do Nova. So but this is as an ongoing book. I had a story that I wanted to do and had a bunch of notes for that. and they approved it as a miniseries. And I was like, okay, well, since this is approved as a miniseries, not as an ongoing book,
right?
And I had lined up doing Lobo at DC.
Oh, okay.
Because again, I was like, I'm just looking for something. And so they had said they would give me a Lobo miniseries. So it's like, all right, I'm now kind of committed to doing these 2 miniseries.
Right.
But I might as well do this Image Comics thing.
Right.
I'll do a miniseries there too.
You were so interested in the character. Was that because of the John Buscema early stuff, or was it the later Carmine Infantino, or what was it about Nova that
I was all in on Nova. I was all in. When that book started, I was there from issue 1, and that was one of the few books where I could be in on the ground floor, because most everything else had been going forever by the time I got into it.
Right.
So this was the first book where it's like, oh, I'm in on the ground floor. I'm in with issue 1. And I was a Nova guy. Like, I'm ready. I love this book. I want to do this book. I want to work with this character.
That's great.
And you know, and I it's like I didn't really get to do, you know, at that point I didn't get to do what I wanted to do, and it was like, oh, it's frustrating.
Yeah. So so then when the whole Image discussion started, so how did your involvement in that start? Did you get a phone call from Todd? How did that work?
How it worked was in San Diego, me, Jim Valentino, and Rob Liefeld had dinner with Dave Albrecht from Malibu Comics.
Malibu, there you go.
And Rob asked Dave if he would publish a comic by him. And Dave said, I publish a comic by any of you guys.
Right.
And so that was just, the seed had been planted.
I see.
And Rob had decided, I'm gonna do something for Malibu and see if the audience that I've got over at Marvel would transfer over to something else, just to see how much of a thing. And they worked out a deal of what they were going to be. And then he took out an ad in the Comics Buyer's Guide for this new book. Yeah. And I think it was called The Executioners.
Yes, that's where you got a cease and desist, right?
You got it had an X in it. But those guys just freaked out at Marvel. They were just like, they read him the riot act. They were calling him up and yelling at him and saying, you can't do this. And really what we got out of that was that they were really scared that that something like that could work. And at that point it was like, hey guys, I think there's a possibility here.
Let's do it. Yeah.
And let's try this out and see how this goes. And at that point it was like, all right, well, who's out there? Who could we get on board that would make this, you know, really work? And it was like, well, we got to get Todd on there. We're all friends with Todd.
Okay, there you go. So he came in more later. There you
go. Todd got, and he was like, "Oh, why didn't you guys let me know you were doing this? This is good." And so, you know, once he was on board, then he was the most militant and active recruiter of other people you'd ever run across. So he was like, "Oh, we gotta get Jim Lee because he's Marvel's golden boy."
Yeah.
So that's funny. That was a big one. Is a big catch, because if we could get Jim, then it was like, oh, we got all of them. We got all the big guys off all the books. You don't have anything left at that point.
Right. Yeah, and that's right. That's interesting. So it's basically a little bit of a rebellion test market with that Comics Buyer's Guide ad with Liefeld, but it was actually a dinner with Malibu. And then all of a sudden McFarlane's like kind of leading the charge on making it happen.
Yeah.
And how did you feel about that? Were you like, okay, well, this could work, or, well, I'm going to do a few miniseries, so I'll just might as well do this too? Like, how was that?
Yeah, well, I mean, once it really got going and the discussion really was, we're gonna do this, then all the other stuff just kind of fell by the wayside.
There you go.
Pretty quick.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was like, the enthusiasm was contagious in that regard, where it's just like, all right, these guys are definitely into this. Everybody's excited about working on this.
Yeah.
Let's just keep this ball going.
Yeah, that's cool. So then it was just, you were just all in at that point.
Yeah.
So then there was that famous room discussion where DeFalco and Terry Stewart and McFarlane and a couple guys were talking about, okay, we're going to do this. And I think
I was not there.
And you were not there. You and Silvestri weren't actually in that room, right?
I don't know if Mark was, because I wasn't there.
Right. You were, right?
So it's like, I have no idea who else was in that room.
So, and what was your impression? Did they tell you about it after? What was
they told me about it afterwards. It's like, all right, if that's the way we're doing things. That's fine. And it was weird is that they went and they crossed the street and went to talk to DC.
Right.
And then DC was like, oh boy, we're excited that this is happening, that these guys could come over, and basically came over to say, and we're not coming here either.
Right. That's right. It was like a call of arms and almost like a declaration of war, right? In a way.
So yeah, that was some fun.
And I just find that so interesting that actually happened. Okay, so then now was Jim, so as far as starting Image, also Whilce Portacio was originally a part of it, but then he kind of left, right? He had some family issues or something?
Yeah, initially he was going to be one of the partners, and he was one of the founders, but he didn't really like the decision-making process of it, and he just wanted to be part of the creative process. So,
I see. So yeah, the more corporate stuff.
The setting things up and deciding who gets to do an Image book and who doesn't, who's in and who's not. He wasn't really into that part of it. So it's like, all right, we're not going to force anybody.
Right. And so then you and the 5 others kind of stayed, and then you formed each one has an imprint. You formed Highbrow Entertainment, right?
Yeah.
And so under Highbrow then, right now this is still under Malibu as publishing, but you guys have your own imprints, or you guys have your own little companies, but then it's all under an Image Comics banner.
Malibu was out of it really quick. They were there. We were part of them for 1 year.
There you go. Yeah.
So by the time I was doing other stuff, like we were gone. It did not last long with those guys.
So then, as far as setting up the company, because you had already done and worked in independent comics in the earlier 80s, and also Jim Valentino did some independent stuff back then, you felt pretty equipped as a team to put it together then, it sounds like.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at that point on Spider-Man, I was doing all the jobs.
Right.
And so it was, and on my own, I had written stuff years ago. So there was really no part of the production that I hadn't done, including, printing comics and stapling them. So
right. And so, yeah, exactly. Because as a writer artist on Spider-Man, now being writer artist on Savage Dragon, that's a smooth transition creatively. Yeah. But then corporate wise, how did you guys? Did Jim Valentino have some? Was he like kind of a main ingredient of that, or was it more of like, how did you guys figure out the corporate end of things?
It was just roundtable discussions with everybody there, just trying to figure out how we could make this work and what the structure of everything was going to be. I mean, it was very give and take in that regard. And and it was sort of decided really early that we were just going to all own our own stuff,
right?
And that there wasn't going to be any cross-pollination of any of that. There's not going to be any co-owners or anything. We would just, everybody, you're on your own. And then we decided early on, okay, if there are team ups or crossovers, everybody just owns their own book. So if a character is crossing over, everybody just keeps their own money on their own books, and and the other guy just can just considers it advertising for their for their stuff. So it's like, let's not be suddenly having to own pieces of other people's stuff. This is just going to get too cumbersome, and we don't want that.
And so then, was there anything in particular that led to creating its own company and separating away from Malibu? Or was it like, look, we've done a year of this, we're viable, we can save 10% if we just do it ourselves? That's basically what happened then.
It was that. It was just, what are these guys bringing to the table at this point, and why are we still here?
Right.
We don't really need them. So let's go.
Let's go. Let's do it.
That's what that was.
So then, even though you guys still had your own separate brands, you still had a bit of a shared universe, though. Like there'd be crossovers.
Yeah. It was shared forever, for a long time.
Yeah. So it really did create. You guys did create an Image universe, basically. So was there ever like, hey, I want to use your guy for this, or how did that happen?
Yeah, it was very much like that. It would just be, hey, can I use Savage Dragon this issue? Sure.
Okay.
When it wasn't even, and my thing with that, and even to this day, what is, if you're publishing an Image Comics and you want to use Savage Dragon, the answer is yes.
But they should ask you first, right?
Yeah, they should ask. I mean, run things by me. And I mean, there was some goofy ass shit that happened because people just didn't understand some pretty basic stuff
about the character.
Yeah, just about the character or how things work, and a lot of stuff. You start working with other people, you'd be amazed.
Yeah.
How wrong things can get.
Yeah.
Oh, you don't understand my character a bit. That's interesting.
Right. And then that could kind of, so then what, you would just kind of call whoever had used them wrong and say, hey, maybe next time do this instead, or something like that?
I think for the most part, we just kind of were like, oh, well.
Right. It's just more fun. Yeah.
That happened. That's just
that happened. Okay. Yeah.
I in my own brain, I kind of reconcile how this sort of thing goes on. Whenever you're talking to somebody and they're telling you about some event that you're aware of, and you're always sitting there going, that's not how that played out at all. It's sort of like eyewitness testimony that you realize after a while that, oh yeah, eyewitness testimony is really unreliable, because people's memory is just, they're really subjective, and it's really bullshit. Yes. And on my own stuff, I was just like, my character in other people's comics is essentially eyewitness testimony.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a good way to look at it. Like a Tarantino movie, right? Where it's like from different angles, from different views.
It's like, whatever. I don't care if you get it wrong particularly, because I don't even really care that much.
And yet it's not like you have to reconcile it in a later story.
Yeah, and I didn't want it to be like that, where we're constantly like, oh, and then I got to write your story out of continuity, and then we got to do this. It's like, don't even fucking worry about it. Just move on.
Just have fun. Yeah. So then, and I love what you did with Savage Dragon, because that 4-issue miniseries and the series after, I really felt like what it stands apart, I think, from a lot of the stuff coming out at that time, because there was like hot women in tight costumes, there was big buff dudes fighting, but the dialogue and the message, and I felt like they were real characters talking. I felt like there was a lot of humanization. I felt like you had a real knack for that. I mean, obviously you still have a real knack for that, but I read it and it's like, this really stands out. Like I could read this and I could keep reading this. That's how it felt.
Oh, good. Yeah, no, I somehow stumbled on that, and just having a knack for just fairly natural sounding dialogue.
Yeah, like they sound like different people. That's not easy to do. And then also I liked how you made him a cop in Chicago, which is just such a cool idea. And then you did it, but it wasn't like totally. You still also commented on some of the problematic things that can happen in the police as well. Yeah. It wasn't like a one-sided thing. It was like there was a lot of texture and dimension to just being a police officer, being an honest police officer, but sometimes there are some that aren't. And it was all just done in I felt like a really balanced way. I like that you picked Chicago too, just because you don't get that a lot.
Yeah, no. I just wanted to be able to destroy a city and not have anybody else get in the, it's like, just let me have my own place so I don't have to worry about what you got going on in your place.
Yeah.
And Gary Carlson was kind of from the Chicago area.
Oh, yeah.
So there was kind of all right, well, I'll just use that as kind of a jumping off thing. And also way back when I had done my fanzines years and years and years ago, I had those stories were kind of the end of the comics that I did when I was a little kid.
Mm-hmm.
So what I wanted to do at Image was to basically go, well, this is the point that I want to work toward. I want to work towards those stories. Mm. And then I'm going to redraw those stories at some point. Mm-hmm. and then I'll take it from there. I'll finally be able to continue on from where I left off when I was in high school.
Right.
And
right,
so
that's right.
And what happened with that was because I had in those stories, Dragon was like an ex-government guy.
Yeah.
And so when it came to doing it at Image, it's like, well, what would logically lead into that? Where could I start him? And so that having a police officer, I thought was, all right, well, I could see this as progressing from this job to that job. That would make some sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where that idea of having him be a cop came about, was just working backwards. Basically, the idea was, I'm not going to repeat the same crappy stories I did when I was a kid, but they'll both kind of be working towards the same goal. And then once I got that towards that goal, and once I got there, then I could go and do anything.
Yeah.
So,
Erik, have you ever had feedback from police, any fans or kids of police, or any interaction with actual officers that read the book or read the book?
Yeah, I've had some. There was when there was I know when there was a dragon statue, that there was a bunch of guys who chipped in and bought one for somebody who is in the off. Oh, we got this for the sergeant and stuff like that. There's some camaraderie of sorts. Where
That's
somebody
cool.
would be like,
yeah, that is cool.
Here, I gave you the shoulder patch from blah blah blah, and it's like, oh, that's cool.
That is awesome. And I noticed that there was some fun, and maybe I might be just reading into it, but too much. But it felt like there were some Marvel references in some of those early Savage Dragons. Like you had this character Arachnid,
yeah,
and the thwip with his webbing. It felt like a Spidey reference to me.
Yeah. There was definitely some stuff in there, some meta message.
Yeah,
stuff
meta. Yeah. And then the dragon was called the Incredible Hunk by his neighbor. And then there was one and then there was one where he fought Overlord, and he punched him against the walls like a big page spread, and then it says Doom with an exclamation point. And when I read that, I'm like, I guess Overlord does kind of look like Doctor Doom a little bit. Like, I didn't make the connection until I saw that. And that
was actually me. The reference there was more on my end was Simonson doing that.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Because the font, the font looked like that. You're right. That's funny.
Yeah, I wasn't actually thinking of Doctor Doom, but yeah, he is kind of a Doctor Doom sort.
And then one that was funny because there's like commentary. Jim and I were talking earlier that there's commentary on the industry. Like, you'll kind of critique like some aspects of the comics industry. You age characters in real time. There's also one, Johnny Redbeard's Next Men, which was pretty funny. Which felt like a John Byrne Next Men commentary.
And it was supposed to be like all the characters from all the books that he had just left in a huff.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
because I read those. I mean, I liked them because I like John Byrne, sure, but it did feel, when I read that, I related to what you're writing because I felt some of that. Like, it wasn't, there'd be those kind of things going on.
And can we just add that Alex's statement there about liking John Byrne is his own opinion, and it does not reflect comic book historians.
That's true. Yeah, Jim is not as much of John Byrne guy. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm totally into it 100%, but when I was a kid, I loved it. Though, I'll tell you that much.
Oh, I was all in on it to a point,
right.
And then at that point, it was like, oh, this guy's kind of a dick. What the hell?
Yeah, that's my point.
That's the whole thing. Yeah. Then there's some other things. So let's see. Okay. Then now there's this whole talk about the books were doing awesome. You know, a lot of money was being made. A lot of comics were being read. Fans were loving it, and you guys were basically the rock stars of comics. And there was some discussion of some books were late, some weren't, but those late books were kind of affecting comic shops and sales. And then tell us, so you guys hired Larry Marder to act as like an executive director for Image. What was the mentality behind that, and what did he end up doing for Image?
I think Larry Marder was supposed to be there to keep the peace within the guys, because prior to that we had Tony Obita, who was just like a pal of Rob's, and kind of the thought was, well, this guy's really in Rob's corner when push comes to shove. So maybe we need somebody who's going to be more of an impartial person when it comes to just Image in general, and I think that was the thought process. And I didn't know Larry at all. I didn't know his background. I didn't really know where he came from or anything about it. I was always like, yeah, whatever, guys.
Yeah, because you were kind of just
reading Tales of Bean World.
I'd never read of Bean anything.
But what? Read what?
Tales of Bean World.
No.
Oh, that's what Marder was famous.
I knew later on, but I knew he did this stuff, but it's like, well, what's this got to do with us?
Right. So highbrow entertainment, you're just kind of doing your own thing then, basically, right? Because you were always kind of like that, because your books weren't really known for being late, right?
Not really. I had one book that was late enough that was returnable, and that was enough of a lesson to decide not to do that again.
Right. Because I think you're pretty much always like that reliable, like you're reliably pumping out product all the time, I think. Right.
To a degree. I mean, I've had my days. I've had times when it hasn't been as reliable as I would like. And that's usually cases of me just taking on too many stupid things,
At
or
one time.
there still is writer's block that does come
Oh, I see.
fly
What
into
you're
the face
saying.
of whenever you want to get shit done. Suddenly it's like, oh, by the way, we have decided, your brain has decided it can't figure this out.
Oh, I see.
Oh,
Yeah. So now, on top of doing your own writing and art for Savage Dragon, Highbrow Entertainment was also publishing other titles as well, right? Like you did Super Patriot with Geffen, with art by Dave Johnson. That was in 1993, I think, right?
Yep, I think.
Yeah. So you basically kind of you were creating these characters like Super Patriot, Mighty Man. Mighty Man was like a Shazam kind of guy, right? Like a
Cap Marvel, but
yeah, Cap Marvel kind of guy, right? And so then, how was working with like other artists and writers on characters that you created? How was that process?
It was pretty simple. We would just sort of talk through. Usually, it would be a situation where I would go, here is point A and here is point B. I want you to get from this to this, and that was kind of where things were at with like Super Patriot was kind of had been mind controlled or something when he showed up first in Savage Dragon. So it was
brainwashed, yeah.
So it was like, all right, Keith, I need to get from him being controlled by somebody to him being able to be a functioning person, so I can have him join Freak Force. So get me there, buddy.
Yeah, right. And then so with like working with other creators on those comics, were you basically hiring them as freelancers? How was that exactly?
Yeah,
freelancers, right?
Freelancers, and I was art directing stuff. I mean, I was really a real editor in that I, when stuff would come in, and sometimes you'd have to talk people off a ledge in a way where they would go and do something that wasn't very good or didn't. Yeah, it was always complicated. Dave Johnson started drawing Super Patriot. He'd done 7 pages, and it was really limp dick stuff. And I and I had to call him up and just be like, dude, I hired you because I liked what you were doing in your sketchbook. Your sketchbook is awesome. Right. And this stuff is boring. What the hell? What are you doing? And he took it to heart, and yeah, man, sorry about that. I just got this style that I can turn out really quickly, but that's not what you want.
Right, yeah, you want the quality in there. It's funny because I was reading some of your letters pages, because you're doing letters pages too with your comics, which is pretty cool. And one of them, on one of the, like, responding to a fan, I think a fan said, I love Super Patriot. And you said, well, we're coming out with Super Patriot miniseries, and I've seen some art from Dave Johnson, and it's looking awesome. But it's funny to hear that. But maybe that was after, when you got the second wave.
Yeah, maybe. Once he got a fire under his ass.
There you go.
He really he performed.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Stuff on that book.
Yeah, that's important. That fire under the ass is actually a key thing.
Well, with a lot of artists, you kind of would find that you look through their sketchbooks and you see what they like to draw, and what their, where their passion lies.
I see.
And sometimes you can get some out of it, like, oh, you really like to do this one thing, and yet when you're doing your regular comics, you're not doing that.
Yeah.
The hell, and a lot of guys, I think, on their own, their stuff tends to be more cartoony and expressive, but they feel like, I've got to do this commercial work, and this is my commercial style, and it's very refined, and it's like, it's not necessarily what you do best,
right?
And I think with a lot of artists, what they really need is to have that conversation where somebody just says, no, it's okay for you to do the shit that you like to do.
Yes.
Your natural whatever is better than so many other people. Just do that, because there are a lot of guys who do that kind of middle of the road comic book stuff. If we want middle of the road comic book stuff, we got choices, man. But there's nobody who's giving me this cool thing. So if you can do that, that would be way better.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So now by 1995, Image was having reliable successes with Savage Dragon, Spawn. The Darkness and Witchblade were also reliably successful. And in that year, USA Network put together 2 seasons of the Savage Dragon cartoon, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how did that come about? That's interesting to me.
We had pitched it as to CBS, and had gotten a bunch of stuff together for that, and then they ultimately passed on it. And a couple of the guys who were part of it ended up being part of this new pitch to the USA Network, and we just found a different approach. Initially, Mark Evanier was part of it when it was at CBS.
Oh, okay.
And he had inserted some of his own characters that he had come up with as part of the thing. And when we went and did it at USA, it was like, all right, no outside characters.
Right.
That didn't work out so well.
Yeah.
And I think Mark's take was a little too divorced from
the comic
book, I thought. And he kind of introduced remember Steve Lombard in Superman? He was just kind of Superman's foil or Clark Kent's foil. He had kind of introduced a Steve Lombard type character that was going to be in this dragon thing, is taking credit for shit the dragon would do and stuff like that. And it didn't really work in terms of the book and in the tone of the comic. And ultimately they passed, and we just ended up going elsewhere with it.
And then how did the USA people get on board with it?
I don't remember.
Oh, okay.
I don't even remember what that process
entailed.
So
it was just pitching, and then eventually
I
USA
had
said
an
yes.
agent at the time. I don't remember if I was even in on those pitches.
Honestly. Oh, that's funny.
I don't even remember. It's a long time ago, and it's just lost to me.
So did you find it to be a positive experience?
It was positive enough. I mean, it was nice that it gave it an awareness that it wouldn't have had otherwise. And so there were people who will even to this day go, yeah, I got into Dragon via the
TV show, the cartoon,
because that was my introduction to it. Which was, that was great.
Did it increase sales for you?
No.
Okay, it didn't actually increase.
It didn't have any effect as far as I could tell on sales of the book. But it was a nice little paycheck so I got a good chunk of dough for that.
That's nice. That's good.
That helps. It's just, hey, here's a little something extra for your efforts.
Right.
So that was nice. And then it was kind of a neat process just to go, oh, there's my dude walking around
on the TV. So you didn't really have much creative influence on the actual cartoon itself then?
Not as much as I had thought going into it that I would have.
I see.
And so there were things where when we were deciding who was going to voice the character, I had something in mind, and then it wasn't that. I picked one guy, they picked another guy.
Oh, that's funny. So the voice you felt was off.
Yeah, the voice was off. There was a bunch of the story stuff that I wasn't super happy with. There are a lot of different things here and there. Just ended up being a problem for some reason or another. It's like, oh, you can't use this kind of character because that's, this is a terrible stereotype you've got going on in your comic. We can't have that.
Oh,
and
no,
the thing is that when you have a diverse cast in your comic book, you can kind of do those stereotypes as long as you got something else.
Yeah, right.
There are people who are lazy individuals, or who just want to take it easy and cruise with stuff. And it's like those people, they exist. And for me, it was like, as long as I've got 10 different characters who are a different way, it's fine to have some character, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. It's okay to have a little bit of stereotype because in a way, maybe they need representation too, in a sense.
Well, I think the problem with say black characters in a lot of shows is that you're going, well, this is the only black character in the show.
Right.
So when that black character is the only black character in the show, they're representing their entire race. It's like, this is all we have is the one guy.
Right.
So if you've got just the one guy and he is a lazy guy, or he smokes, or there's anything about him that's deemed wrong or offensive or
yes.
It just becomes, well, this is a bad thing. You're saying this now about every black person.
Right.
Whereas if you're sitting there going, I've got a million characters, then it's not such a big deal. I mean, in a way, if you look at the cartoon Mulan, you can look at that cartoon and go, if there's a couple characters in this show which isolated are super offensive.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But in the context of that show, they're not.
Yeah.
Because you're not saying all Asian people look like this one guy.
Right. That's a good point.
You can.
Yeah, because there's heroic, there's this, there's that, there's this.
And it's nice to be able to have that kind of variety, and that's something I think ends up getting lost when you've only got one character. Is that you end up going, well, now every single character that's just a single character, they're really bland because they don't want to offend anybody.
Right.
And so anyway.
So then that affected what choices they made in the cartoon, you're saying?
Yeah, there ended up being some choices there where they're like, okay, we can't have this character be black because that's offensive.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, is it fine if it's a white guy who is overweight and lazy? And it's like, oh no, it's totally cool.
Right.
Okay. Awesome. So we'll make all the white guys lazy and stupid and whatever, and all the black characters will be awesome, which is fine, whatever.
Right. I see. Okay. and that makes sense too. Yeah. It's testy when you're being a creator, you're putting out stuff and a
bunch of weird things that they kind of come up, because it's like, well, how come Alex Wilde is colored darker? And it's like, well, because she's Mexican. And It's like, well, her name's not Mexican. It's like, well, she's adopted.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of a cumbersome backstory. Can we change her last name to Rodriguez?
There you go.
Like, no, because that's not the character in the comic.
Yeah.
And like, well, then does she have to be Mexican? Well, how about if can she still be colored as though she's Mexican?
Yeah.
So it ended up being this weird compromise of, well, she's no longer Mexican, but she's colored as though she's Mexican.
Right.
And it's like, well, how much would she be referring to herself as being Mexican anyway?
Yeah.
People don't really do that.
Sure.
So what's it matter? Fine, as
Right.
long as she can be colored as though she's Mexican, you know, and we'll pretend that she's white. I have no problem with this because it's the way it would be anyway. And and they're like, okay, fine, but now we need a Mexican character.
Right.
Like,
so now that just changes the whole thing.
Yeah, and so ends up being a lot of weird back and forth on
compromise
stuff. And at one point they were really frustrated because they didn't have any positive white characters. We don't have any positive white male characters. Ended up being a problem. And it's like, well, there aren't a lot of positive white male characters in the book, and the lead character is green.
Right.
So, what are you going to do?
Yeah, it's like you're creating this kind of tentacled web in a way.
Yeah.
So then, now in 1996, this was kind of fun. So that whole project with Howard the Duck and Steve Gerber, and the Savage Dragon crossover. And then it was this kind of interesting thing where you guys ended up having, where there's a crossover with Marvel, where it kind of in a way led to the real Howard the Duck now going over into Image, and now he's Leonard the Duck, like he's kind of undercover.
Yeah.
What a fun thing. Tell us about that.
Well, that whole thing came about. Initially, the idea was it was just going to be this unofficial crossover, which will make it fun for Steve and fun for me or whatever. And we're just going to do this kind of unofficial thing.
Yeah.
And then Steve got wind that they were going to be using Howard the Duck over here, and he was going to be using over there, and they're going to have all these other writers working on other Howard the Duck things. And he became really kind of upset and disillusioned about the whole project entirely. And he was sitting there going, I don't know that I can write this story anymore because I just don't like what they're doing. They kind of, at one point, were making it seem like it was my character and they were going to just let me be the only guy doing it. But now they're clearly, that's not the case. They're doing all this other stuff.
Yes.
And so what I talked him into was, well, what if we kidnap him? And let's just do a story where we just go out of our way to, get him out of Marvel, and we'll just do it like that. And then he got re-energized about the whole
There you
thing.
Go. So that was your idea.
Yeah, that was my idea.
That's
and
awesome.
that was just to get him to be able to do it at all, because he was going to bail in the middle of it, which would have been bad for he ended up doing the Marvel story, which he wouldn't have done otherwise. So in a way, it's better for them, but I understand that at one point that might have not worked out so well for some people at Marvel.
Yeah. So then, so then he became Leonard the Duck over at Image, and then that Howard the Duck that's in Marvel essentially is a clone of the original, which I love that, because I think most people think Steve Gerber was Howard the Duck in a way.
Yeah. Well, he put a lot of himself into his work, and I have not worked with many writers who struggled as much as Steve did. I mean, he put hours into that stuff, and I guess it shows. It shows that he really is putting a lot of himself into it. But it just didn't ever occur to me that, writing can be that difficult.
Right.
Because it always came very easy for me.
Yeah. So then, was Steve a nice fella?
Oh yeah. He's a great guy.
Yeah.
And,
because it's cool that you helped him with that, and Jack Kirby helped him with the Destroyer Duck stuff. So it's like another link to Jack you kind of have as far as kind of being in his role in a sense.
Yeah, well, it was the kind of the crossover in a way happened because he wanted to reintroduce Destroyer Duck.
Mm-hmm.
He was writing Strike Force for Mark for a Top Cow book, and he had introduced this robot thing that was going to open up and it was going to be Destroyer Duck.
Right.
And
yeah.
And Mark was not having it. He was just like, and I was like, dude, you've got a cartoon cat running around in your book. What's the matter? And he's like, well, that's a robot cat.
Mm-hmm.
Destroyer Duck is a real duck. And he was just having this tough time, like, wrapping his brain around this idea of there being a real duck walking around in his universe.
Uh-huh.
So he kind of foisted Steve off on me to see if we could find a way of doing it in my comic. So that was how that kind of came about in the first place. And then just a lot of these, just the conversations just work out going this way or that.
Uh-huh.
And stories come out of it all somehow.
Right. That's awesome. Then in 1999, Martyr left Image, and then Valentino, who was used to publishing his creator-owned comics, formalized Image Central. He became the publisher of Image. Tell us about that transition.
I don't know much about it.
Okay.
Honestly, I'm not. I can't shed too much light in what went on there. My recollection of it was that Martyr felt that his. Well, maybe I do know more.
It sounds like you might know. So, yeah.
My recollection of it was that Todd had some internal stuff going on at his toy company, TMP.
Uh-huh.
And so Larry had been brought aboard as kind of a peacemaker of sorts, but by the time his tenure ended, a lot of the reason he was there was no longer there because Jim Lee had left,
right,
and Rob Liefeld had been kicked out.
Mm-hmm.
So as a peacemaker, there wasn't really any peace to be made because there wasn't any points of conflict at that point.
I see.
And then Todd had points of conflict at TMP, and so he needed a Larry to come in and negotiate some kind of peace agreement over there. So that became, we need this guy, and then we became, well, we need a publisher, and Valentino was, I kind of would like that gig.
Yeah.
Because he at that point, I think, was kind of done making comics.
Right. Shadowhawk.
He always kind of felt like, I think he struggled a lot more as an artist than some of the rest of us did.
Uh-huh.
And I think he kind of was not getting the kind of success making his own comics.
I see.
And he was kind of like, I need something. So it's like, I need this.
Yeah.
He did love that job.
The publisher job.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Was he a good publisher then? It sounds like he was.
He was an interesting publisher in that he made some unusual choices, which I think some worked out pretty well, and then some really didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of the bad was that a lot of the mainstream guys were less inclined to pitch stuff at Image. And I actually heard from a few people who said, I just don't want to be turned down by Jim Valentino. That's
right.
Like, oh, That's kind of a shitty way of putting that, but okay,
Yeah.
I understand.
Uh-huh.
But he brought in a lot of his alternative guys, and so
Right.
certainly there was some interesting choices being made, and he brought in some kind of people that probably would never have come in otherwise. And
Yeah.
some of that stuff was there were interesting books, you know.
I see. So he was turning down some books that could be categorized as possibly more mainstream.
No, he
wasn't.
he wasn't turning things down because they weren't knocking on the door anymore.
Oh, okay.
So I think a lot of people who would have been more mainstream were just kind of like, okay, Image is doing something different now. There's a place for me there.
I see. Because of his alternative stuff, he was kind of pushing through. Okay.
And so it's like, well, we got to publish a certain number of books in order to make the nut. So let's do that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's fascinating. Which, I mean, that goes back to like was that Normal Man? That's what that was, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Normal Man. Yeah. So then, all right. So then then one more question before Jim talks about the next phase is when Liefeld left. You know, you guys had to do that vote, and some conflicts were happening. Lee sold Wildstorm to DC Comics. You know, what was your impression of these guys at that point? Like, were you like, okay, times are changing and people come, people go, or did you feel like, man, I can't believe this is happening?
Yeah, more the latter.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't happy with how things were
mm-hmm.
going down. I certainly would have preferred that we would have all stuck with our guns and stuck with our books and done what we could do.
Mm-hmm.
But Jim Lee was having problems. He was not finding huge success once things had settled in.
Okay. Uh-huh.
You know, his own creator-owned stuff wasn't setting the world on fire. People like Jim Lee on books that they like. They don't like him necessarily in the abstract. And there's several artists who are like that. You know, George Perez. When George Perez is on books that people love the shit out of George Perez. When George Perez is just working on random other stuff, his creator-owned stuff never really did much of anything.
Huh. That's interesting, and that's true though. I never formalized that in my head like that before.
Yeah. So same thing was happening with Jim, is that, you know, he wasn't as into Wildcats as he had other things that he wanted to do, and Wildcats was kind of going with other people. And so he did I don't remember the name of his book, and Max Faraday was part of it. It had a long title.
Yeah.
And that was going to be his new creator-owned thing, and it just, nobody wanted it.
Oh, wow.
It just wasn't a big book.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what was kind of happening with a lot of guys is they were looking around going, I am hip deep in this stuff. I have rented this huge studio space. I've got a lot of people that work for me, and if my books don't sell at a certain level, I can't make payroll.
Right.
I got guys here. I can't do this shit.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas on my own, I didn't do any of that. I just I never had a studio that was a physical thing.
Mm-hmm.
I just worked out of my own house and had everybody just work from their own houses.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
You know, so they would send in books, and I would publish it, and I would coordinate everything. But I never had a studio, and because of that, you know, I also never had a house style as some of the other studios seem to do.
I see.
Rob's would have a room full of guys who drew like Rob, who were big fans of Rob.
Yeah.
And Jim Lee, the same thing, would have a bunch of guys who were kind of doing half-assed Jim Lee.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. So basically, by having that low overhead, you had more freedom to just kind of be creative and produce, and you didn't have that. Yeah, that's right. I've heard of the overhead with Liefeld was kind of high at one point, and then with Lee also evidently. So that's an interesting distinction. So it puts more pressure on them, and then now you have Lee maybe not hitting that same point, and then selling to DC
and
Comics.
Basically, he had to sell to DC because he was going to go away.
Yeah.
You know, it's like here are our options. I can sell to DC, you know, and then with DC, they were into it because hey, we can get Alan Moore back.
Yeah.
We wanted to get Alan Moore on stuff, but he wouldn't work for us. So, you know, part of him making that sale was I got to go talk to Alan Moore and make sure Alan's going to still do this stuff if it goes to DC.
Right.
And then Alan, that became, well, as long as I'm not dealing with anybody there and I'm just dealing with you guys and there's none of this, we'll be fine.
Right.
I think is how that ended up being sold to him was all right.
Yeah, as long as he's isolated, kind of away from the DC stuff in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. I love his Image stuff. I took some time to read all that, like 6 months ago. I'm glad I did. He's always a good writer, though. I like all his stuff.
He's a talented guy. There's no two ways around it.
Right. All right, Jim, go ahead.
Okay, so it's 1998, and obviously there's still stuff going on at Image. But what made you go back to DC and do Aquaman?
It became that I hadn't done anything else in a long time, and I kind of felt like people at Marvel and DC may not have remembered who the hell I was. And because it had been a long time since I'd done anything. And so my thought was, I'm going to go do some stuff over at Marvel and DC, and then maybe I can get some of those readers to follow me back to Image.
Because you'd been gone for a long time. So for Marvel readers those fans, you needed to reestablish your name a little bit. Yeah,
that was the thought process going into it. And I had been talking to Chris Iliopoulos, who was my letterer, was also doing stuff over at Marvel and DC. And we just started talking about, well, what the hell would you know, hey, they're looking for a writer on Aquaman. And what would you do if you were doing Aquaman? You know, and then we just started kicking ideas back and forth. And then it just became, shit, I got too much stuff here that I could do. That would be kind of fun. Let's see if they're into it. And so we pitched it at them, and they said okay, and so that became a thing.
Was that fun for you? Sort of a return to Aqualad?
To an extent, it was. I don't always get along very well with editorial.
Oh, I see. Because you're your own editor in a way. So
I'm my own editor on my own stuff, so I don't have to deal with anybody else's bullshit.
Right.
But suddenly, when you're thrust into a situation where you're having to deal with somebody else's stuff and what they want and what they expect, it can get complicated.
Yeah.
That leads to an interesting question for me. Having done this twice, back in the earlier, at the beginning of your career, and then here in the late 90s into the 2000s, was it different working for Marvel versus DC, and what were the differences? And when you went back in the late 90s and the beginning, had those companies changed a lot?
I never found there to be much of a difference between the two in terms of in terms of much of anything. I mean, there were a couple people who worked in a different way that was different from what I was used to, in that Mike W. Barr on The Outsiders was writing full scripts, which was not something that I was working with other people. Other people were writing plot style.
Mm-hmm.
And I took some liberties with that, which I always took liberties. I never even thought, oh, this is gonna upset people.
Right.
But I do shit, and then I find out later, oh yeah, that really pissed that guy off.
Oh, that's funny.
Oh, well, what do you know? But
because you're a storyteller and a a yourself, so
yeah,
it's like, how can you not put your own stuff in it?
Yeah, it's totally fine. Like Mike, when he did his Outsiders, and I know this is jumping back, but he wrote a full script which seemed like he had just written it all out and then just broke it up into panels afterward. Because it was like this whole issue, you got a splash page, and then every page thereafter is all 5-panel pages. There's none that had more or less.
Mm-hmm.
And both of the issues that I had worked with him on, he had done that. It's like one was all 5-panel pages, and then next was all 6-panel pages. And I just thought, as a guy drawing this stuff, God, we need to open this up when there's a big villain show up and there's a big reveal. That needs to be a splash page.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. So what I did was I go, all these panels are going to be in here. They're all going to be in the same order. But when there's characters talking or there's small action going on, I'm going to move those to these other pages and open it up so I can have there be a splash of the villains, and they can have there be, when it's a more complicated fight scene, that I can show it better. Mm-hmm. Which I guess he wasn't super happy about. But.
Yeah. But your storytelling is effective. It's worked for 30-something years, obviously.
It's worked out all right.
Well, when you went back, though, did you have more clout? Were you able to push a little more because you were far more established than you were back in the Outsider days?
Not really. Not a lot. I was writing at this point, and I was coming at it as a writer, not as an artist. So it was a little different in that regard. And I was, but before, when I was just an artist, I wouldn't have that much back and forth with editors because there just wouldn't need to be any.
Right.
But now, when I was working with it, other than meet your deadlines, that sort of thing. But now it would be like, okay, well, here's your proposal, and you have to write a proposal to get the book, and then it is, all right, now you got to write the stories that are in this thing, and what are you doing here, and where is this going, and all that other kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very different kind of process than, draw this.
Right.
So was Aquaman, was that was the only thing you did at DC over it, or the main thing you did at DC over that period, right?
Yeah.
But at Marvel, and around the same time, you went over and took over what was probably their biggest character at the time with Wolverine, right?
Yeah, but first I pitched Nova.
Yeah, no, I was going to
really?
say, but you never gave up. You actually got to do Nova this time.
They bit, and it was like, all right, well, finally I get to do Nova.
Was it as much fun as you thought it was going to be?
It was different because I wasn't drawing it, and so that in itself created some different things. And in retrospect, I probably it would have been better to have my Wolverine artist do Nova and my Nova artist do Wolverine.
Oh, that's interesting.
But it is what it is. And I mean, yeah, it was fun to finally get some of those stories out.
Right.
But it's and man, they tried to promote that thing, but it did not do super well.
Oh.
Did Wolverine do well?
Wolverine did very well.
Yeah.
Yeah. But by that point, the editor actually asked me to do Wolverine, whereas with Nova and with Aquaman both, I had to write proposals. But with Wolverine, it was a situation where I just said to the editor, "Look, man, I am really tired of writing proposals. So you and I are going to have a conversation here. Mm-hmm. If at the end of this conversation you want me to do the book, I will do the book. If not, no harm done."
Right.
And so we talked through the Wolverine versus Galactus story over the phone. And at the end of it, it was like I had the book. So.
Oh, that's cool.
So let's talk about the Fantastic Four World's Greatest Comics project. How did that come to be? You were a pretty major player in that whole series, that 12-issue series, right?
And that was from several conversations with several different people. One of them being Bruce Timm, who was somewhat instrumental in that, and with Eric Stevenson, who was also somewhat instrumental, and just being fans of the Stan and Jack Fantastic Four, and just coming in and going, isn't it a shame that it petered out the way it did? And wouldn't it have been cool if they decided, let's go out in style, let's just tell the biggest, boldest Fantastic Four story we possibly could on our way out the door.
Uh-huh.
That had so many artists who obviously were super influenced by.
That was the idea.
Yeah.
The idea was we had pitched it as, let's try to have this be on model Jack Kirby. And that was the idea, because Bruce being from animation, where people have to draw in other people's styles all the time.
Right.
Like you've got this all the time. Mm-hmm. We've got people that you tried to do, couldn't we get a bunch of guys to draw like Jack Kirby?
Right.
And then we managed to get a bunch of guys who could not draw anything like Jack Kirby all together to do this book. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was like, could you, if you really tried to, draw just like Jack, Bruce? And he goes, well, that Avengers 1/2? And I go, yeah. I was really trying to draw like Jack. I was like, Bruce, you suck. And you guys, I know. And so, God, we tried, and it didn't seem like the memo that what we were trying to do even got out to some of those guys. Mm-hmm. And, some issues are better than others, and some pages are better than others. And we did what we could, but yeah.
There's some nice page. Steve Rude did some in the last couple of issues. One in the last couple of issues. He's always a great Kirby artist.
Yeah, he's always good. Ron Friends sit there and did a bunch of pages with obviously Jack Kirby sitting out on the drawing board while he was doing it. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of swipes in there from a lot of people trying their best to make it look like it belonged.
And you were doing layouts on some of that.
I did layouts on it, and I ended up doing layouts in 9 of the 12 issues. So I think I got credit for more of them than I actually did. And I managed to get really sick over the course of that, as I had taken on way too much, because I was at the same time doing the Defenders at the same time. And so between Savage Dragon, the Defenders, and this book, it turns out that was a little more than I'm capable of doing.
Yeah, you felt stretched thin.
That was the last one I wanted to talk about for this period of your Marvel stuff. And he wouldn't come back for almost 20 years, I guess.
Yeah, but I did my initial foray back in there, drawing wise, was they needed somebody to do an issue of Spider-Woman,
right?
John Byrne thing, and John Byrne and I had words on numerous occasions.
Oh, really?
Never met the guy, but he was, to say that he was a little jealous of the success of Image Comics is to put it mildly.
Oh, fascinating.
And he really felt that the Image creators were the worst things to ever happen to comics. And that, we were all terrible and we were destroying comics. And sort of, from that, it just, but I was always a big fan of John's work growing up. And so it was kind of like, well, this is not cool to find out that somebody who's you're a real fan of just has this huge disliking for you, from my point of view, just kind of out of the blue, or in the abstract, I didn't do anything.
Yes.
So this issue of Spider Girl or Spider Woman show was, they needed somebody, and a friend of mine, Andy Smith, who is pals with Bart Sears, had worked with me before, and he knew that I could do a comic pretty quick if need be. So he talked to his editors and saw if I could work on that. And so I decided, all right, let me do it. And that was kind of fun, because it was John wrote full script, but John just broke it down into panels. He didn't break it down into pages at all. So so I could kind of do what I did with Mike Barr, where I would just tell the story however I wanted to tell the story, and kept the panels in the right order, and we're good to go.
Right.
But something I decided to do in that was to have little caricatures of myself and John Byrne being the best friends ever. So like in the credits page, it was like me with my arm around John and a little word balloon doing "just visiting, folks," and several places along the line, when there would be a caption, I would just put both of us in there just clowning around.
That's
and
awesome.
Just tiny little cartoon versions of us. And that seemed to be fine.
Well, that's great.
I'm sure he was just seething when he saw it.
Did you guys ever talk on the phone with each other?
No, never did.
Wow.
Did we? I don't know that I ever talked with him.
Okay.
No, not on that. I know at one point I did ask him about participating in the Fantastic Four thing, but I think I asked him via email, and he was like, this doesn't sound like a project that I would be interested in working on. I think mostly because he didn't want to have anything to do with me. But I didn't know that. I don't know that he would have done a great job being part of it. But what I didn't want is for him to be out there telling everybody that nobody ever asked.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, I'm gonna at least ask, knowing that there's a really good chance that he's not gonna want to do it.
Right. Because from an ego standpoint, you can say, I turned that down. So
yeah, which is fine, you know.
Yeah.
And I would rather have him saying, I turned that down than they never asked.
Yeah, right. Right. That makes sense.
So let's just do the Defenders real quick. With something like Nova, I understand how hard it is for that book to make it for whatever reason. But the Defenders seems like a book that it has some of Marvel's biggest stars, and yet it besides its first run, it's never really had a lot of luck. What did you want to do with it, and how did it work out?
I kind of wanted to do what we did, but it didn't work out. It didn't sell as well as I would have liked. I eventually had to leave just because I had gotten sick, and it was like, I can't continue to do this because it's killing me, because I was doing too much stuff. And it's like, well, I know I'm not going to quit Savage Dragon. So, I think I need to wrap this up on the Defenders and have this be the end of it.
Was it sad for you to do? Because it was a fun book. I mean, I thought it was
a fun book. I think there were things I like about it and things that I was less happy with. I thought it would be a better book than it was. And there were some things that I didn't think worked out super well. There was some reveal with the Valkyrie that I thought that story was really convoluted, and I, as a creator, didn't really follow what it was. But there was a scrambling that had to go on there, because one of the story that we wanted to do ended up being really similar to something that was going on in Thor that Dan Jurgens was already set in motion. So it was like, well, we can't have it that the Enchantress is disguising as one character in Thor the same month that she's disguising as somebody else in the Defenders. So, Dan started first. You guys got to come up with a different story. And so we ended up using Lorelei, which just seemed like a little out of the blue, and I don't think it ended up being as solid a story as it would have been had it been somebody else. So there's a couple little fumbles here and there, but also I didn't think it was as good as a Kurt Busiek comic, and I don't think it was quite as good as an Erik Larsen comic. So in some way, the combination of these two guys just weren't as good as we were on our own. And I'm not really 100% sure of why that was, but somehow it was that way. And
so was there a lack of chemistry or a different vision between the two of you?
I think there probably was, but I can't pinpoint it as to what exactly went wrong, but it didn't seem to me like it quite worked as well as I would like.
And then you went back totally to Image, and was there a reason that you didn't go back to DC or Marvel for as long a period, almost practically up until just recently?
No, not really. I mean, for a lot of it is just people not asking, so if they're not knocking on my door, I'm not necessarily knocking on theirs.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
And that's kind of how that works out sometimes, is wasn't really thinking about it. I wasn't thinking, oh, I'm not going to work for those guys ever again. It's just, I'm doing this other stuff. I seem to be enjoying doing this other stuff. I'm going to continue doing that.
Mm-hmm. So then Valentino left being a publisher in 2004, and then you became publisher. So how did that shift come about? Why did Valentino leave, and what made you decide that you wanted to try your hand at being the publisher of the company?
Well, I thought that with the books that he was pumping through being less and less kind of mainstream, I thought that something needed to change, because we weren't having huge success with these kind of indie books, and something needed to happen, and it needed to happen soon, I thought, because it's like we need to right this boat, because this isn't going the way it ought to go. So I was the dick, and I actually came in there and said, we need to get rid of this guy.
Oh, wow.
So it was not a situation where he wanted to leave. He did not want to leave.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, and I it wasn't nice.
Uh-huh.
But I think it was necessary.
Mm-hmm. And did you paint your body green and wear a fin when you did that?
I might as well have. It was a shitty situation, and I fully acknowledge that it was a shitty situation.
Uh-huh. So did that have an effect on your guys' just personal relationship as well?
I can't imagine that it didn't. But we were never like super chummy anyway. It wasn't like we had ever shared a space together or worked together super closely. So so in a way it didn't change things, and in another way it really did.
Yeah. Does Valentino still work at Image?
Yeah, he still works at Image. He's publishing stuff now. There's a bunch of books that say Shadowline on them.
Oh, yeah, right. His imprint, but he's still publishing stuff from people submitting him, basically.
Yeah,
through his brand.
Basically, he just started doing his indie stuff, but through his own kind of imprint at Image, rather than have the whole company be
the whole company.
Because I kind of wanted to get there to be stronger mainstream stuff,
right? For the Image banner.
Yeah. Did he bring in Kirkman, or was it you, or was it right around in that transition time with Invincible?
It was kind of both. Basically, Kirkman wasn't having any success getting anything done and getting anything approved through Jim. So what ended up happening is I had him and Corey Walker do a Super Patriot miniseries, which I said, let's just treat this as though it's your own book. Right. I'm not gonna take a dime from it. It's just gonna be your own book, and you do what you do on this thing, and I'm gonna approve it and what have you. But let's just treat this as it's yours. And that was kind of a proving ground, which led to him eventually doing Invincible
and Walking Dead. Yeah, I loved his Marvel Zombies. I thought those were fun. So then, as publisher, then, and Bomb Queen, that's under Shadowline, then, huh?
Yeah, that was definitely Jim.
Yeah, which that's a fun one. So then, as publisher, so what were your main duties as publisher? let's say separate from the Savage Dragon and Highbrow Entertainment, what were you doing as publisher that was in addition to then what you were doing before, as far as like your daily routine and the job and everything?
Well, I was going into the image office for one.
Uh-huh.
And I had a desk there, and I was dealing with any correspondence that needed to be dealt with, and I was approving books and trying to recruit other people to come on board and and do stuff here, and and going through the submission heap and picking out creators to do things. And a lot of what I was doing early on was fairly hands-on in terms of books that existed in Image already, to just go, okay, well, this book isn't doing so well. Maybe you ought to consider doing a different logo. Have you tried this approach? At one point, I was doing some character designs for noble causes that he wanted some different looks for stuff, and I was just doing drawings for characters from that, and coming up with logo ideas for that, or coming up with suggesting different artists or finding different artists for people to work with. On a number of different things.
Was it a fun job? Did you like it?
It was a fun job, and it was kind of fun to be in the office and to deal with other people. Because it's like Image or doing comics can be like solitary confinement, and and it's nice to suddenly be in a situation where you're suddenly having to interact with other people.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, this is kind of neat.
What city are the Image offices in?
At that point, the Image office moved from being in Southern California to being in Berkeley.
Oh, okay, so that's close to you.
Yeah, and I, at that point, was living in Oakland, which is right next to Berkeley.
I see. There you go.
So, yeah, and so that became the new normal, and I became a guy who went to work. Right.
That's awesome. As opposed to like kind of doing the work at home all the time. Were you then doing also Savage Dragon at the Image office too? Like, were you just combining it?
Yeah, I was, but it was going really slowly. There was a couple years there that I ended up putting out like just 1 or 2 issues a year, which was, not what I wanted to be doing.
Right.
And once the ship was somewhat righted and we were doing books that were doing better, eventually I got to a point where I was like, all right, I want to get back to doing comics.
Yeah. And that was in 2008, right? Where then you were like, okay, I'm ready to retire from this and do comics now, right?
Yeah, something like that. I don't even know the years. But yeah, that came about, and it was like, all right, let's just call it a day.
So now I'm going to kind of go over some milestones. After that, then Jim has a couple other last questions. Is in 2015 you worked on Spawn as a writer and penciler with Todd McFarlane co-writing, and he inked the book. And that collaboration went from issues 258 to 266 and ended in a Savage Dragon crossover, right? How was working with Todd on a book like that together? Is he fun to work with? And when it works in between Image creators like that, then you're basically working as a freelancer under his thing at that point, right? Is that how that kind of works?
Yeah, that was work for hire.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't like it at all. Yeah, that was kind of if we're ranking most miserable times doing comics, that's going to be high up there.
Oh, really? Why?
Just because we have a very, very different sensibility as to how to do comics and ways, approaches to doing things. And I think we were just kind of not seeing eye to eye on that. In any respect.
That's fascinating. Okay.
And I just kind of, and there would just be things where he'd decide he was going to move panels around from one page to another.
Oh, really?
And
okay.
he was going to, I would write dialogue and then he would rewrite it. And he had a tendency to kind of repeat the same information over and over and over again. And it was just like, what are you doing, man? And he kept wanting to slow everything down. Oh no, we got to build up to this and take more time. And I would, and Todd inked digitally. So I would actually send him, I sent him inked stuff. It was, you could have printed what I was sending him.
Yeah.
And then he would draw on top of it, sometimes using what I did, sometimes straying somewhat. But it was fairly collaborative in that regard. But yeah, it was much more contentious in terms of the writing end of it.
Yeah.
And so I was sitting there just going, man. I hate everything about this.
That's funny.
And just the books would come out and be like, oh man, I had in mind a much different comic than this.
Yeah, I guess flavor wise, because Savage Dragon is more like it's action, there's story, it comes at you at a pretty fast pace. And then I guess Spawn, it's like more of a noirish thing, right? Kind of.
And he's wanting to do something else, and he wants to build up to stuff, and he wants to, I'm on Savage Dragon. The book's set in real time, so I'm sitting there going, I've got to cover a lot of ground because I'm covering a month worth of stuff at any point. A month is going by. So I can't have characters doing nothing this month. They got to get somewhere. Yes. And whereas Todd is not in that same mindset at all. He's doing something completely different.
Right. Huh. That's an interesting contrast there. Then in 2016, 2017, a couple things happened. Inkwell Awards. You got 2 Inkwell Awards for inking your own pencils. You also, in 2017, saw the release of Savage Dragon 225, celebrating 25 years of the Dragon and Image comics in an epic 100-page extravaganza. So when these things are happening, it must be, kind of gratifying, right? To see the fruits of your labor over decades. People are celebrating it. How does it feel? Is it a positive? Is it a positive feeling, or is it kind of laced with some? Well, it wasn't always easy. What is it?
Yeah, I mean it's all of the above, and it's never been easy. There's never been a time when making comics has been like, oh, that was a snap. No problem. It's always just this epic struggle of pushing the rock up the hill, time after time after time, and it's always like, oh, I'm amazed that I was able to somehow get this done. Now I got to do it again.
Right, that's right.
And but like everything else, you don't really sit there and think of it in terms of, I'm going to sit down and write 200 issues. I'm going to sit there and draw 200 issues. You just kind of do it a bit by bit, and then suddenly over time you look at it and go, oh, this is this huge amount of stuff.
Yeah.
How'd I come into this with the thought process of, I'm going to do 300 issues? Damn it.
Right.
That might be more than you could even conceive of. It's
Yeah.
just it's so overwhelming that because there's so much of it.
Mhm.
But when you're just doing it, well, I can do a page, or I'll just do this page,
Mhm.
and suddenly 200 issues passes. Like,
Right.
oh, okay, that's how that happens.
Yeah. So then, and now it's the year 2020, and you'll have published 250 straight issues of Savage Dragon. I think it's making it the longest running comic book character from a single writer artist, right, of all time.
There's probably a couple others in there.
Yeah.
Dave Sim did an awful lot of
Cerebus.
That's
Cerebus.
true, yeah.
So the 300 issue mark there was kind of one that Todd noticed and I noticed, and it was like, oh, we got to do 300 issues.
We got to go 300. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Savage Dragon as a character has grown. How much of you is in the character of Savage Dragon? Because some people, I've heard some people say maybe that was like an imaginary childhood friend of yours, or something like that, or it's his id and his superego kind of maximized on a volume of 100. Would you say that you are Savage Dragon?
Not so much.
Mm-hmm.
My quips don't come as quickly as they do with him. Mine is like he doesn't have any hesitation, whereas in real life, I would be one of those guys who comes up with the clever retort on the drive home. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, I should have said. But when you're writing comics, you've got time to think about that. You don't need to have that split second.
Yeah.
So there's little pieces here and there where we'll go, that's kind of something I would say or something I would do, but not really, not a whole lot. Mostly I'm just making up a dude.
Yeah. That's cool.
Okay, I have before I get to your current work at Marvel, I do have a form question in relation to Savage Dragon and everything you do, which is, I kind of feel like that people should have to get a equivalent to a driver's license before they're allowed to do double page spreads, because so many people don't know how to do it and they just drive into the ditch or they abuse the process, and you're really good at it. I mean, I know I say that having looked a lot, and I remember that issue that you did that was nothing but double page spreads, which is really hard to do.
Oh yeah. I will attest to that.
So what is, in your opinion, what is the secret to doing a good double page spread? What does it need to have in order for it to be worth doing?
Well, that's ultimately what it is it's got to be worth doing. You've got to pick a moment which is visually compelling and visually interesting, and then you've got to fill that space wisely.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't just have it be a bunch of dead space. It's got to have that moment where you go, oh wow, cool.
Do you look for multiple dimensions? I mean, does it have to have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, yes, but you can do a double page spread that's just a big face, but you better have a good reason story-wise for that, and it better be a nice looking face.
Right. That face better be good if it's 2 pages.
Yeah, if it's you need to. It's like if we're pulled in on something, why are we pulled in on it, and why shouldn't this be one of many panels on another page? Mm-hmm. Why is this worth the space that you have devoted to it? And that's what you do, is you try to find the answer to that question. Mm-hmm.
And did you look at other people's work in terms of mastering that particular concept, like looking at how Kirby did it, or how Steranko did it, or different people?
Jack's really good at it. Steranko is really good at it, and then Few others are okay. Walt's pretty good at it. And then it drops off from there because some people just can't do it at all, and it's just a mess.
I think Tim Sale knows how to do a double page spread. There's a few people.
Well, you're making that good use of that space. And I think that's it. Is you're not drawing a small panel bigger.
That's exactly right.
You're putting more information in there, and that's why it's a double page spread. It's a double page spread because it needs to be that.
Right.
That's great. That was the question I most wanted to ask you, because I think you're really good at it, like I said. So now let's go back to the current stuff you did. You've got a Captain America The End book coming out now, which is already caused
It's just one issue. That's all that is. It's a one shot.
But I want to segue that into what you think of social media as a creator, because I saw the dumbest things posted about that because of the credits where it said created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And people were writing things like, well, this is probably Larson's doing. And it's like, no, it's not some plot by you.
No, well, that's the only page in the book that I had nothing to do with.
Right, of course.
I didn't place the ads either. I'm sorry if that offended anybody.
So do you ever get tired of fandom in terms of that kind of jumping to ridiculous conclusions?
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, but what can you do? There's a certain number of things that are within my power, and there's a bunch of things that aren't, and that's one of them. And that ultimately, when there are things like that, that can lead back to, I'm not doing this again. I'd prefer to be in a situation where I'm in control. Mm-hmm. And that always ends up, whenever I stray, I always end up coming back to doing stuff at Image and going, oh, thank God.
Right. Back to the normal world, yes.
Is there some other stuff still to come from Marvel? You also did a Spider-Man something as well. Are there other things that are coming out from your little bit of Marvel assignment stuff?
Nothing that's been announced.
Anything super exciting that we're not going to hear about?
I'm actually not sure at this point. I know that there's some talk on stuff. I'm not sure if I'm going to end up doing it just because.
Oh, okay.
Just because of the way things are. Mm-hmm. And I'm not pissed at anybody or anything like that, but it's just so much easier and more fun to do this shit on my own than it is to suddenly be working with other people in these other constraints, and some of it is just really basic stuff of things that just drive me up the goddamn wall that I don't even know that other people even notice. Mm-hmm. But it's definitely things that I notice, and it just drives me crazy. Because
you have something to compare it against, right?
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of these people, they don't know any different.
Yeah. When I do this on my own, this turns out like this. And when I do it with somebody else, this turns out like this. What the hell happened?
Yeah. And that's right. That's what happened. Like when you have your own business, and then if you were to like work on some big corporation where you're kind of in that cog, I totally get that.
Last question. Do you have a finished date in mind, and do you have a last story for Savage Dragon?
Nope and nope.
So you don't know how it's going to end?
Nope. because
that's awesome.
Because it keeps changing.
Right.
Characters keep getting older.
Mm-hmm.
Life keeps going on. You know, it's like I've got places where I want to get.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but it's like it's kind of like life. And you know, you sit there and you go, well, I know where I want to be in 5 years, but you're not necessarily sitting there going, well, how's my facial hair going to be at that point? You know,
Yeah.
You don't necessarily have all the little stuff figured out, but you might have the broad things like, you know, I want to be married in 5 years.
Right,
you know,
right,
I got to work towards that because I'm getting old. Damn it.
Yeah.
And so you know, I think all of us have these kind of just little life goals, and a lot of the characters have their life goals where they want to go and their places they want to be. But it's like, how do I know that I don't get sick 2 years from now, and then I'm not sitting there going, well, I've got to wrap it up now.
Right.
So
Yeah,
my last issue is not going to be the last issue that my last issue would have been if I knew that there was going to be more time.
Right. For sure.
You know?
That's interesting. That's a good way. I mean, that's existentially, that's an interesting observation.
Sort of the opposite of Dave Sim, where he knew it was going to be 300 for a long time, and it was always going to be 300.
Yeah, but I'd like to do more than 300. I'd like to be able to go, you know, I want to do the kind of run where you just go, all right, maybe I'll do the second longest run. You know, that sort of thing. Where you look at it and it's just like, what the hell? He did 500 issues? That's insane. Mm-hmm. Who would sit down and do 500 issues? You know, but I don't also want to set that out as a goal either, because it's like if I'm sitting there 3 years from now going, that's it. I want to be able to go. I want to be able to leave it at any point.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And that's
Alex,
more of a
that's
free
it for me.
feeling. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, Erik, you know, we really enjoyed today's podcast, and something I want to say is there's a thing about the comic book auteur, the writer artist. You know, you have people like Kirby, you have Simonson, you know, Chaykin, and Byrne is a writer artist. And for certain, you're in that category where you're creating and writing and drawing and a true storyteller. And you know, it's also the nut and bolts of running a business. I think you really bring an interesting West Coast perspective on comics, and I really like it because that's kind of in my mind in comic as a fan. That's where I came from. So I really and Jim and I are just really excited that you're able to spend some time with us today. Thank you so much.
All right.
For all the time, because this was a long one, and we really appreciate it.
I know. I'm surprised my wife hasn't knocked on the door and just started yelling at me.
Well, that's called every Sunday for Alex and I.
Yeah, that's right. So this has been another episode of Comic Book Historians with Alex Grant and Jim Thompson, with very special guest Erik Larsen. Cheers, Erik, and excited for the next issue of Savage Dragon.
As am I.